welcome everyone to our board meeting for the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. I'm Jeffrey Hales, and joined here by my fellow board members. I'll introduce them in just a second, but wanted to mention a few things at the start of this meeting. So this is a public meeting. It is being both broadcast and also recorded, and so the information and archive for today and the materials for today's session are all available on our website. And so you can go there if you don't already have those materials and get the information related to today, or to refer to the webcast and after today's meeting. In addition, I would note that as always, this is a public meeting. However, it is not interactive with the public. And so we don't have an opportunity to take comments or questions from those who are listening in today. But as part of our transparent operations, we do always encourage your input and your feedback into what we are doing and at the various stages of our projects. And so you can go to our website and look for the Contact Us page, where you can get information about how to reach out. If you have general comments, you can follow the public comment periods that are ongoing when we get to that stage in a project, and engage with us in that respect as well. So if we go to the next slide, what I'd like to do is introduce the fellow board members. So as I mentioned, I'm Jeffrey Hales. I'm a professor at the University of Texas at Austin and chair of the Standards Board. And we'll go through in alphabetical order. So today we'll start with Verity Chegar, who is one of the co-vice chairs. Morning, Verity.
Hi, everyone. It's a great day for standard setting.
As always, thanks for being here. I believe that our other co-vice chair is unable to be here today, Bob Hirth. So no doubt he will be listening into the audio cast afterward, and has already kind of given his input to the staff along the way. So moving on, we've got Kurt Kuhn. Kurt, welcome.
Good morning, Jeff. Yeah, Bob gave me his proxy, so my vote counts double today.
Kurt, your vote always counts double. Thanks for being here today, Kurt. Lloyd Kurtz, welcome.
Morning. That's funny because Bob also gave me his proxy, so that's interesting. We'll have to work out how that's going to work.
It's great. I can see we're all chipper. I'm going to have to keep you all on task today. Dan Geltzer, welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Good to see you all. And I'm not going to claim that Bob gave me his proxy.
He knows he doesn't need it to be weighty in his comments. Elizabeth Seeger, welcome.
Hi, thank you. Good morning.
Mark Siegel, good morning.
Good morning. Hi, everybody.
Thanks for being here. Suzanne Stormer. Good morning,
Good
Suzanne.
afternoon here from Copenhagen, Denmark. Pleasure to be here.
Great that you can join us. Thank you. And Stephanie Tang.
Hello, good morning and good afternoon, everyone.
Morning, good afternoon. And alphabetically last but not least, Mark Vassen. Good evening.
Hello, everyone. Good to be here from the Netherlands. Good afternoon, good morning.
Great, thank you. So we have 10 of our 11 board members with us today, and it's great as always to have everybody here and engaged. I know that they'll be jumping in and we'll have an active conversation as we always do when it comes to our topics. So let me spend just a moment talking about some of what we have on deck for today. So I'll give you a quick overview. This is our table of contents, but perhaps it makes more sense to go directly to the agenda. So on the agenda, we've got a pretty full schedule for today, but we're going to break it up into two major parts. So for the morning session, the way I think about this is we have 3 projects that are all further along. And so all of these projects have moved through the public comment phase. And so we've actually proposed some specific changes to 2 of our industry standards, as well as to our conceptual framework and our other governance documents, the rules of procedure. And so we're going to be getting an update from the staff on where we are, what we've heard back from public comments, and some of the redeliberations that have been ongoing, and the continuing engagement that we have related to those projects. And so what we'll see is that they're at various stages of progress, getting close to some of them being quite close to being finalized, and others having an opportunity for more improvement and work to be done there. So that'll be our morning session, our first session of the public meeting, I should say. So conceptual framework, tailings management and extractives, and then systemic risk and asset management. And then in the afternoon, we're going to be talking about some of the work that is ongoing, but at an earlier stage. And so one is a standard setting project in alternative meat and dairy, where we're going to be looking to potentially have a decision around adding an additional industry to that work stream. And then some quite early stage work that has been done with the marine transportation industry. So we'll be getting an update from the staff there. And we'll have some concluding remarks as well. So a full agenda, but we'll start off, as we always do, with an overview of what our work stream currently is more generally, and maybe touch on some of the things that won't be on the specific agenda for today, but that will nevertheless be part of what we continue to work on behind the scenes on an ongoing basis. So for that, I'd like to invite Lynn Chia, who's the Director of Research Standard Setting, to join. So hello, Lynn. I know it's for you, it's quite early in the morning, West Coast in the US. So thank you for being here. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to you. I think, Suzanne, you're also on camera still. I think we'll both go ahead and turn our cameras off and leave it to, the floor is yours, Lynn. Good morning.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. Always a pleasure to be able to discuss with the board our standard setting agenda. And before we go into the specific project sessions that Jeff has already previewed, we wanted the opportunity to remind the board as well as with the public our current portfolio of standard setting as well as research projects that technical staff is working on. This slide provides an overview of right now our set of 13 active projects, both between research projects as well as standard setting projects, and a couple of our work streams updating our core governance projects. Our research projects focus on continuing to monitor emerging issues as well as changing trends in industries to help us determine if standard setting is necessary in the future to improve the content in our standards on these subject areas. So we're continuing to monitor human capital, internationalization themes, and as well as our research around alternative meat and dairy and content moderation. And as Jeff noted, we will have a session around alternative meat and dairy session a little bit later today. Then shifting over to the right side of this slide is our set of standard setting projects. Most of them are focused in two key phases of our due process right now. The set that are currently undergoing initial consultations research as we develop the exposure draft on how this may look in a standards revision. Today's session won't have any direct discussions on any of these projects. However, we anticipate some of these to be further discussed in future board meetings in December and in early 2022. And then today, we will focus several of the project sessions around projects where we have underwent public comment and the board and the staff have been deliberating how that further feedback inputs into our potential standards update and providing an overall update to the public around that, as well as further how to finalize it. And then if we can go to the next slide, we'll just dive a little bit deeper into the specific 7 standard setting projects and the status of where we are, as well as what can be anticipated as we continue to work between the staff and the board on moving these forward. So the first 2 projects, systemic risks in asset management, as well as the tailings management extractives, are both on the agenda today. We'll be discussing with the board what some of the considerations are for developing the final standards update, with the goal is that we would issue standards update for the relevant industries before year end of 2021. And then we see up on deck is that Plastics Risks and Opportunities project. We're actively working on developing the exposure draft that the staff and board is hoping to release for public comment by early next year. With the raw material sourcing and apparel project, we have just concluded the public comment period and received over a dozen public comments. Staff is currently deliberating that input and with the board and looking to determine next steps in the coming month on whether that will proceed forward to a standards update, or if there are further deliberations and exposure drafts we may consider for the public. And moving down the list is then around content governance and internet media and services industry. We're also continuing to develop the exposure draft targeting that out for public comment period exposure in the first half of 2022. The alternative products in food and beverage project we'll be discussing today in terms of the potentially expanded scope, and otherwise we'll continue with that project as well as a renewable energy in electric utility project in conducting first rounds of market consultations to begin informing the development of the standards update and exposure draft starting this quarter. So this, as the board can see and the public can see, this is a pretty full set currently of what the staff and the board are working on. And in December, we're looking for likely discussions on some of these active projects, as well as potentially a couple of new proposals. And with that, I wanted to just take a second on the next slide to give an update to the board as well as the public on where our work is around our human capital management research project, as this is a key theme that we have been exploring as the technical staff. So continuing forward from last board session where we had an update, the key priority and focus of the technical staff is to finalize that a proposed standard setting project around our diversity and inclusion theme identified under the human capital management umbrella. And the staff is working on determining the appropriate scope and set of industries that falls under that. And we do anticipate discussing with the board this project proposal at the December board meeting. And on top of that, then the two other focus is continuing to evaluate the benefits of developing a technical guidance on prevalent aspects of human capital across the market. And then we're still continuing to monitor the other key themes that have been outlined in the research project preliminary framework. So around labor conditions in the supply chain, workforce investment, worker well-being, as well as around alternative workforce. So while there is no session on human capital management project today, I just wanted to give an update that there is continually a lot of active work with the technical staff on this work stream. So with that, Jeff, that I will turn it back to you and look forward to diving into some of these projects deeper in the sessions today.
Thanks, Lynn. There's always a lot of work that's ongoing, and I appreciate all the work that the research team does to keep that work moving forward. I would also maybe just comment on probably many of the public that are listening in today are aware that there's just continually a number of ongoing efforts that in the policy realm. So we see that the EU is continuing to move forward in developing sustainability reporting standards. We know that the SEC is currently doing a lot of thinking and active work with respect to sustainability reporting issues and climate in particular, human capital as well. And the IFRS Foundation, of course, is doing a lot of work to think about, related to their proposal to potentially establish a sustainability standards board, the International Sustainability Standards Board, to sit next to the IASB under the IFRS Foundation. And so, just to maybe comment a little bit on that work in particular, I just would say that there's opportunities for the Value Reporting Foundation to be engaged in following and where the opportunity arises to directly engage with policymakers around the world, and that's an important both opportunity for our mission to be heard and to be understood, as well as to in some ways directly engage and offer technical advice and suggestions. And so in particular, the Value Reporting Foundation is part of, for example, the Technical Readiness Working Group that was formed by the IFRS Foundation to help the ISSB to have a running start if it's to be, established. And they're anticipating an announcement around all of that in November related to COP26. So this is all you can learn more about it by looking at the IFRS Foundation's website. But we do appreciate the opportunity to engage and offer, the learnings that we've had from our decade of standards development and engagement with the marketplace, and seeing what has really resonated with the capital markets in particular, and the feedback that we've gotten from companies. And not only is it important for that work, but it also plays a very direct role in feeding back to the work that we're doing and suggesting opportunities upon reflection for improvement in our own standards and in our own conceptual framework. And so, that's not independent from the sorts of things we're going to be talking about today. So just wanted to have a few remarks related to that. And I guess I would open up the opportunity for anybody to weigh in if fellow board members have any comments or questions for Lynn regarding our ongoing projects or anything else. If not, I'm sure all my fellow board members are still there somewhere. So no worries, there's a lot of opportunity to engage today. So we can go to the next slide and get ready for our session on the conceptual framework. And for that, Brian Esterly, who's the Chief Technical Officer for over SASB Standards, is going to lead us off on this particular session. So Brian, welcome.
Hi, Jeff. Thank you. Thrilled to be here today speaking with you and to all of the SASB Standards Board members. And Jeff, I think your comments are a perfect segue into the session on the conceptual framework here. So I'm looking forward to diving in.
Great. Well, the floor is yours. Take us away.
Fantastic. So once again, Brian Esterly, and this session is going to be focused on the SASB conceptual framework. So just a little bit of context before we dive in. What we're aiming to do today is to first provide a short update on the status of the conceptual framework project, and then move directly into a discussion on two key issues arising out of market feedback. Two pretty key issues that I think certainly warrant some of the board's time in the meeting today to discuss. We're not looking for decisions to be made today, but I think this is a great opportunity to bring these important issues forward. Share a little bit more about what the challenge is, what the considerations are, and then obtain some board member views in order to help the project and really the project team continue to move forward. So just a little bit more on the high level on the conceptual framework first. I'm sure we all know the objective of the project, but the first objective of the conceptual framework is to strengthen the core principles and concepts that guide the standards board's decision-making on the SASB standards. So the guiding document, if you will, that we use day in and day out in the board and the technical staff standard setting activities. A little bit of historical context here, maybe even first dating back before to when this timeline slide even starts. SASB first released its conceptual framework back in 2013. That guided initial phases around standard setting. In 2017, an updated version was produced, and then in late 2019, the Standards Board approved a project, this ongoing project designed to further improve the concepts and principles embedded in the document. We spent a little less than a year working on market engagement, research, analysis in order to develop an exposure draft. In late 2020 or late last year, the board approved an exposure draft for a public comment period, which ended up being a 120-day public comment period that brought us through the close of last year. I'll share a little bit more on the public comment period and what we heard back in a minute here, but fast forwarding to early this year, first and foremost, the technical staff and the board spent a time reviewing and analyzing public comments. We included this in our February standards board meeting, so there's that recording available from earlier this year, where we did the report out and initial analysis of what we heard back in the comment period. And then from that point forward, the project team dove into further deliberations, further analysis, further market engagements, in order to really continue to push our thinking forward on what the best, most effective conceptual framework for the nature of our work might be. And there were a couple of specific issues that came out of that work, and that's really what we're, at least two of them is what we're focused on here today. The one other thing before I'll move on is that, as Jeff, appreciate your comments earlier on the kind of broader landscape outside of the Value Reporting Foundation, and specifically the IFRS Foundation's work and the Technical Readiness Working Group. This project and the Value Reporting Foundation, really the SASB Standards Board's work on our conceptual framework has been really important in terms of the VRF's engagement with the Technical Readiness Working Group. One of the work streams is to think about conceptual guidelines or conceptual framework that the possible future ISSB could use to guide its work. And so this is something that this organization has invested nearly a decade or so of time into developing our thinking, obtaining input, putting it to use through actual standard setting. And so it's just an area where the organization has had a lot to offer, the IFRS Foundation and the technical group, in terms of thinking about the best, kind of most appropriate, effective conceptual framework to guide sustainability accounting standard setting. A little bit more on going back to the public comment period that, again, we conducted late last year. It was a 120-day comment period. We obtained 30 public comment letters, specifically on the conceptual framework. Just a side note is we also released an exposure draft of the rules of procedure at that same time, and received quite a number of public comments on the rules of procedure as well. We had a pretty good mix of investors, of companies, of industry associations, of others, including accounting firms, regulators, other standard setting bodies, and so forth. So always good to see meaningful response, the depth, particularly the depth in some of the specific responses. Of course, the public comment letters are posted to our website, the Conceptual Framework project page. So anybody listening in today is welcome to jump onto the project page and take a look at those public comment letters. Some really thoughtful and informative ones to keep pushing our thinking forward on our conceptual framework. So materiality is going to be one of the two key issues that we focus on today. So the next couple slides start to dive specifically into this first key issue around materiality. Maybe before I dive in, if I don't mind asking the standards board members, we have two spots in this session, one for materiality and one for the second issue, specifically allocated for questions and discussion. So if I can just get through the next couple slides, then I think that would be helpful to get all the information out there and then have a robust discussion at that point. So picking up from the public comment period, one of the key themes that we heard, and really one of the questions we put out in the exposure draft, was to invite more comments on materiality, how in our conceptual framework we're defining materiality, and even a little bit around the role of materiality in guiding our thinking and ultimately the board's decisions on the SASB standards. What we have heard, I think not just in this last public comment period, but really for years and years now, is that there continues to be market confusion on materiality. We distilled the market confusion specifically what we heard in the last comment period into these three different themes that you see on this slide here. The first is a number of respondents support the proposed definition of financial materiality, but suggest that it could be stronger in certain ways. You see a comment from the CFA Institute, obviously a influential investor association, investor group that can bring very well-informed views on these types of issues and really help guide our thinking on this type of work and even individual projects themselves. So we saw support, but also encouragement for stronger clarity, stronger language in some regards. We saw the middle here, the second theme is that we saw quite a number of respondents encourage further alignment with financial reporting conceptual frameworks, and specifically the IASB conceptual framework. I think we thought this was, on one hand, not necessarily surprising, but also interesting because we took considerable steps forward in the exposure draft to model our definition of materiality off of the definition in the IASB conceptual framework. Nonetheless, there was encouragement from the market to go further, even closer alignment with the IASB definition. Key theme number 3 that we heard is, I think more drastic, more interesting position around how we should not define financial materiality in the conceptual framework. And one of the good examples that was pointed to was around the approach of TCFD, where TCFD doesn't define the concept, but points to local jurisdictions and regulators, the definitions used where companies operate or that apply to companies. I think we're going to explore this a little bit more in just a second here and understand a little bit more why some respondents might propose this. So with that said, I think that it's just important to note at the bottom of the slide that what we did not hear by and large was confusion on the fundamental role and purpose of the SASB standards. So that's not what this discussion is about in any way whatsoever. We're not discussing kind of the very known important fundamental role and purpose of the SASB standards. For example, investors as the primary users. Very little confusion around that. I think a lot of it is around the articulation, the use or application of the concept of materiality, for example. So diving into this first key issue a little bit more and picking up off of this theme of market confusion on the concept of materiality and how it's used or applied in the standards board's standard setting work. So I think it's really important to take a step back for a second and think about the 2 different ways that we use the concept of materiality in our standard setting activities. So first and foremost, materiality is used as a concept to help differentiate the type of information that the standards seek to identify. In other words, we've had these discussions in the past around, it's this concept that we can apply to industries or other areas in order to help filter down really the very, very broad, and some expansive universe of potential sustainability issues, filter those down to the ones that matter for a particular industry in terms of relevance to enterprise value, in terms of useful information for investors, and so forth. So it's this concept, it's this application of the concept to differentiate the type of information that we're looking for. Secondly, we're using the term, even directly in our conceptual framework in a way that helps us clarify that ultimately it is companies that make their own determinations on materiality. This has been the long-standing position of the SASB standards, that we use this concept to help us identify or filter down the information. And at the same time, ultimately, it is up to companies to make these determinations on what is in fact material for them, given their circumstances, the context in which we're operating in, the specific instances of that information. So you see the excerpt in italics there that was pulled directly from our exposure draft, where we very explicitly acknowledge that it's the responsibility of companies in the not just in the use or application of the SASB standards, but more broadly in order to make materiality determinations themselves consistent with the laws and regulations that apply to them in the jurisdiction where they operate. I think that one of the key points, the bottom line on this challenge box here, is that ultimately our takeaway here is that there's a need to more clearly articulate our approach. And I think that's specifically on point number 1, this first usage of the term and how we differentiate the type of information we're seeking to identify. There's very little pushback or concern, I think, in terms of that point number 2. That's broadly consistent with how the markets operate, how legal jurisdictions function, and how other standard setting bodies work. I think the confusion is mostly centered on how we use that concept, even the term itself, the word itself, to differentiate this type of information. So in terms of considerations, that's exactly what we're looking to discuss a little bit more today, is how can we think about, how can we consider improving the articulation of the concepts that guide our differentiation of the type of information that the standards seek to identify. And then importantly, and I haven't gotten into this yet, but I'll get into a little bit more on the next slide in a minute, is crucial to this as well, is I think further improving our alignment and connectivity with financial reporting conceptual frameworks. And I think the IASB conceptual framework is the key example. We took a few meaningful steps forward there, as I mentioned earlier in the exposure draft, but I think we're seeing more encouragement from the market. And given the very meaningful kind of developments going on in the landscape, particularly the IFRS Foundation, I think it should be unsurprising to first and foremost the board members, but also the broader market, that this is really a key pivotal moment to look to create further alignment, or at least connectivity, with financial reporting conceptual frameworks. Very briefly at the bottom, I just want to be abundantly clear. This discussion is not in any way about altering the fundamental role or purpose of the SASB standards. We all know the standards are designed to produce decision useful information for investors. It's a little bit more around our articulation, the concepts that can help the board and the technical staff ultimately do that work. Before I jump on to the next slide, Mark Siegel, I know you've been involved in many of these discussions and been a big resource for the staff and the full board in this area. I'm just interested in if you want to share anything from your perspective, even kind of help clarify anything around the challenge and the considerations where we're looking to make improvements here.
Sure, Brian. I actually think you did a really, really good job of describing what the issues are and the feedback that we got in the comment letter, in the comment letters that we received, which were really thoughtful and thought provoking too at the same time. I mean, I think, as you said, there doesn't seem to be any indication from our stakeholders that there's any dissatisfaction with the idea that we are trying to filter down the universe of possible ESG issues into the ones that are most relevant and most useful for an investor, for a capital market provider to make decisions, whether they're voting decisions or providing capital to it. I don't think there was any disagreement about that at all. I think it was just more of a question around how do you best articulate that filtering and what you're trying to do, which is what you have on this slide as issue number 1, and importantly, what we're not trying to do, which is issue number 2. We are not, the SASB is not and has never tried to disintermediate the entity's decision, the reporting entity's decision, to decide for themselves what is actually material in their facts and circumstances. And I think that so I think the challenge is, what words do we use to try to describe our process to filter down this universe of things that are most useful, most relevant to an investor population, an investor audience, while recognizing that the reporting entity itself actually has the right and the jurisdiction to decide what is actually material for them in their context, based on the jurisdictions that they're in, the legal requirements that they're under, et cetera. So I think that's the challenge that we have. But again, the good news was there didn't seem to be any disagreement with the underlying approach that we take, other than making sure we use words that clearly delineate what we are and aren't trying to do.
I think that's exactly right, Mark. That's really helpful. Thanks for sharing your perspective.
Sure.
Suzanne, I see you up there. I just have 2 more slides to get through. I'd certainly welcome a quick comment now.
No, I wait. I wait.
Thanks. I have a few specific questions to put to you and really the full board here in just a moment. So with that said, and thanks again, Mark, and thanks for your patience, Suzanne. I do just want to build a little bit more on this point around further alignment, or at least connectivity with financial reporting conceptual frameworks. So what you see on this slide here are excerpts from the IASB conceptual framework on the left and the FASB conceptual framework on the right. We put in bold kind of some of the key words here, and some of the points that really jump out at us that have been reviewing for quite a while, but I think are worth a fresh look at, is thinking about not just how the IASB and the FASB approach or discuss materiality, importantly, but also how they introduce, approach, discuss the concept of relevance. So right at the top on the left here, you see the IASB conceptual framework, and they're speaking to relevance, and that relevant financial information is capable of making a difference in the decisions made by users. So that's really interesting right at the outset there, because that's very consistent with what we're looking to do, and especially in that point one around kind of our application of differentiating the type of information. And we're looking to draw some insights from the IASB conceptual framework here. We also see further down in bold the discussion around materiality, how it's an entity-specific aspect of relevance, and it's based on the nature of really the context of the individual entity. Very, very important, and that's the part that aligns with that point two on the prior slide that's perfectly consistent with the long-standing approach of the SASB standards. And then you see very similar type of discussion in the FASB conceptual framework around how relevance is a general notion about what type of information is useful to investors, while materiality is industry specific. So certainly language that we've been reviewing and considering for quite a long time. And again, I think it's worth just a fresh look at, especially in the broader context as we look at the landscape and look for further alignment, connectivity with the financial reporting standard setters, and really deeper integration into the capital markets corporate reporting. So this is the part where I think we can dive into a little bit more into the questions and some discussion across the board. So just again, as kind of background, we've used the concept of financial materiality to identify the type of information that we seek to identify. You see that reflected in the pyramid at the top in terms of the objectives, financial materiality. We also use topic level characteristics on the left there to kind of further implement that kind of identification or filtering of the type of information we look to identify. So information that's financially impactful, investor interest, and so forth. So a few questions here to put out to the board in terms of how can we further clarify the concepts, really even the terms that guide our differentiation of the type of information the standards seek to identify. And then at that topic characteristics level, can we make further improvements there in terms of the concepts that guide, further down in a more detailed way, specifically how we then implement that, that disclosure topic identification, if you will. And then importantly, the area around alignment and connectivity with financial reporting conceptual frameworks. Jeff, that's all I have to report out from the staff perspective on where we are on this first key issue. So I'd love to turn it over back to you to see if what comments you would like to share, any perspectives you have, and then kick the discussion off here.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, that was a really, really helpful review of what we heard back from public comments, and I think and this is really what Mark said as well. Like, you've done a great job of articulating what some of the challenge is with respect to materiality. There are a proliferation of terms, and yet at the end of the day, there is a legal use of the term that varies jurisdiction to jurisdiction that we are not in charge of, and we have historically recognized that, acknowledged that. It's an important acknowledgement for a standard setter to make, but then have still used a materiality term, financial materiality in particular, to articulate some of what we're trying to focus on in our standards. And so that has been incredibly useful, I think, to distinguish some of the things that we do historically, and yet has created some challenges. And so I do see, that there's an opportunity to improve here the language that we use. And I don't think, and to your point, no one's trying to change the objective at the end of the day of what we're trying to accomplish. I mean, we do want the information that is being disclosed to be consequential. Like we want to help companies provide information that users can use, investors and creditors can use. And so that is so linked to the concepts of materiality. But on that previous slide, I thought like there was a really great point that both standard setters made, which is, that they essentially say the board cannot specify a uniform quantitative threshold for materiality or predetermine what could be material in a particular situation. That's what the IASB said. The FASB said no general standards of materiality could be formulated to take into account all of the considerations necessary to make those types of judgments. You need the facts and circumstances. And so, so the way that standard setters operate is to identify what is relevant. That essentially relevant is the higher level concept here. And I think that it seems to have worked pretty well for the FASB and the IASB historically. And I think it's an interesting opportunity for us to consider aligning more closely with that. So I think I've gone on long enough. I have a lot of thoughts on this, but Elizabeth is up here, and I know Suzanne also popped up. And so since Elizabeth, you're already here, invite you to share your thoughts.
Thank you, Jeff. And also want to start by agreeing that I think the presentation was really clear. And as Brian and Jeff know, the first time I heard about this proposal, my first reaction was to say, I'm about to have a heart attack about this, because I think the concept of, or the use of the term materiality in the beginning days of SASB has been so very critical. I've been in the sustainability world for my entire career, and I think the concept of business relevant and financially material really changed the entire dialogue for the sustainability world, and it was many hard-fought battles to get to the point where companies and investors are at the point where they recognize environmental and social issues are business issues. And so my initial reaction to dropping the terminology is because it has been such a hard-fought battle to get to the point where we are today, which is a lot different than when we started SASB many years ago. That said, and I told you I would reflect on this a bit after my initial reaction, I also think that one of the biggest barriers to success in sustainability and having companies and investors take it seriously is lack of precision in what we're talking about, and lack of shared terminology. And so in every single case, I do support being as precise as possible and aligning with the existing frameworks that are out there that drive company behavior and reporting practices as well. So I'm happy to say I've gone through this process of really digesting this information, and now very aligned with the recommendations that are being made here. But also, and I know you recognize this, I think others in the industry, in the sustainability space, well, not industry, but in the sustainability space, will need to go through that thought process and really be walked through this quite carefully, because I think we do run into the risk of a communications error here if people interpret this as something it is not. So just wanted to say thank you for doing such a good job describing it, and I'm supportive of the recommendations that you're making here.
Thanks, Elizabeth. One thing I think is like what we're really doing is like we're recommending that we think about this more than anything else. I mean, I think it's still a bit early to.
Fair.
Yeah,
I agree. Anytime we can be precise in general and align with how other people are talking about it is good. And also need to think about how we would communicate this publicly.
Yeah, really important points, and so I think that's like part of what I would love to kind of like dig into and hear from is like, you know, if we're thinking about improving some of the language, what, you know, if we change any of the words, what would help? Like, what would be a benefit of that, and what would be a challenge? You know, if we look at like our objectives up top, and you know, right now it says financially material, decision useful, cost effective. I think, you know, what Brian's opening remarks kind of like delineated was that financially material captures a lot in it, and also sort of buries a little bit as well. And some of what I've heard in terms of feedback is that we could be more clear about who we're trying to speak to. We're trying to speak to investors and creditors. That's implicit in financially material, but financially material is kind of more like it just sort of speaks to a threshold level as opposed to an intended user of the financial statement. So you know, there's an opportunity to more clearly articulate decision useful for investors, cost effective for issuers, for example, and thinking about, you know, where does the essential concepts of what makes something relevant, you know, that links to financial materiality, where is that already kind of embedded in some of our language, and what can we do to improve some of that as well? Suzanne?
Yeah, thank you very much. And Elizabeth, you practically took the words right out of my mouth, which was good, because then I can talk to maybe elaborate on my experience. So let me start with the conclusion to say that I am also very supportive of giving a hard think to this, because if anything, then my experience has taught me that words do matter. And so does the detail of using those words. And I've also come to appreciate that when we talk about these things, then there's a different vocabulary, whether you speak, you know, you can speak English in Europe and you can speak English in the US or in China, and it means different things. So I think that needs to go into the equation as well. And then just share, when I was a report preparer, and we at Novo Nordisk were integrating the sustainability report into the financial report, we had 5 filters of materiality to work with. So we had the AA1000 that we used for our sustainability reporting. We had the IFRS that we used in the financial. We had DRI for sustainability reporting. We had the IRC integrated reporting framework, and we had SASB. And we just realized there was no way that we could accommodate all of those 5 in one. So we actually ended up making kind of our own amalgam of those, and leaning very much towards the integrated reporting terminology, which is quite consistent with SASB's. So what we've been talking about and how I've refined my wording is about enterprise value creation or erosion. And I think that makes sense in the work that I do today when I advise companies on how to work with sustainability dimensions of performance. And when I do recommend using SASB, as I do on a daily basis, I always emphasize precisely what you said, Jeff. It's about being decision useful and cost effective, with a view to understanding better that enterprise value creation or erosion potential. So I think I'm all for all of that refining. I think where I would just then raise the flag to factor into the equation is that, like Elizabeth said, we've introduced materiality into the sustainability world to show how sustainability thinking interconnects with financial thinking. And we've been quite successful at that, to the extent that we now have the VRF with a clarity that reporting is for providers of financial capital. That is a big achievement. But at the same time, in Europe, we are working with the term double materiality. And I would like to see how we might be able to, if not square the circle, then at least find ways of accommodating those two perspectives into how we think about what companies should include in their reporting as important, relevant, material information. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Suzanne. Really great comments. Appreciate that context, that background, your experience that you've had as an issuer on the corporate side. And just to maybe echo one of the things that you mentioned there, you talked about the importance of linking to enterprise value. I think that's really crucial. And so I think as we're looking at the wording that we use, we want to make sure that the wording actually captures all of what we try to accomplish in setting our standards. Since we can't set standards for company-specific facts and circumstances, what can we set standards for? It's a more general notion of what would be relevant to the users, and we focus on investors and creditors. But even more specifically than that, like to your point, Suzanne, about value creation, it's about their assessments of a company's ability to create value. And so right now we have some topic characteristics around financially impactful, right? Around what's of interest to investors. And I think there's an opportunity to make sure that language is like clear enough to help our thinking, help us to communicate when we talk about these issues. But I also think of like we could actually probably describe that maybe more clearly by saying, when we say relevance to investors, what do we mean? I mean, we mean that it's financially impactful. We mean that it's of interest to them, and that's the evidence that we look for. Those are the components of relevance and we can highlight that more clearly. It wouldn't change what we do. We know what we do, but it might help us to articulate and help this conversation to continue to evolve. Mark.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Well, there's already a lot said that I agree with by Brian, by my fellow board members, and by yourself, Jeff. But I do want, just for the record, I think that there are two good reasons, to really think about to making the change that we're talking about. And one is indeed the fact that we more and more go towards connectivity between financial and sustainability. Well, if you look at the whole discussion that we're having at the moment around the ISSB, it's all about how do we connect the two dots, right? How do we connect the sustainability world with the financial reporting world? And I think that's the more we can actually harmonize definitions, the better it is. And I think that is a very good reason. And the other one is, I think, just on the basis of the feedback that we have received, and that just demonstrates that our constituents are actually confused at the moment by the words that we use. And I really appreciate that. Clearly, I don't have the same background as Suzanne and Elizabeth, and I do appreciate that. We need to be very careful that we in our communication, that we signal that we're not changing anything in terms of our intentions, but I think definitely to make the change and to emphasize maybe that in the topic characteristics, we're still talking about financially impactful information, right? That we streamline more with the financial reporting. So that's what I wanted to go on record for. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Mark Siegel.
I just wanted to amplify a couple of things that have already been said. I mean, Elizabeth's points were spot on, and I think the timing of where we are now versus where we were 10 years ago, just actually in the 3 years that I've been almost 3 years I've been associated with the organization, Elizabeth made the point about how early on we were trying to assert and make sure people understood that sustainability issues were actually business issues and should be embedded in the in the overall organization. And I think almost every day now I'm having conversations with companies, but actually not with sustainability people at the companies, with accounting people, with reporting people, with general counsels, et cetera. And that's a huge change, at least in the States over the last just the last few years. And the challenge that I'm having is every time we have these conversations with finance professionals and you have the word materiality thrown out there, but the next 5 minutes then becomes a reconciliation between the way that they understand the word materiality and the way that we're using the word materiality. It's become a little bit of an impediment to them jumping on and fully adopting and adapting to what the SASB is trying to do, while they I think they ultimately totally agree with the filtering mechanism. And so the timing and where we are now is a little bit different. So I agree that we should think about being a little bit more precise. And I really am taken by the way the IASB's definition works. I also want to reiterate just that the comment letters that came in, I want to thank everybody for sending in those comment letters. They were so thoughtful and provided such good perspective on this. It was just really helpful to see. One of the points that came up that Jeff, you alluded to it briefly, but I think it's worth highlighting here on this slide as you're looking at the triangle. The piece on the pyramid that isn't shown explicitly is the user population and the audience to whom we're trying to provide the information. And I think if we were to explicitly point out that we're looking for decision useful information for an investor audience for enterprise value, I think that really helps with characterizing what we're trying to do, because then you've got decision useful, you know, which people understand. You've got relevance. You could use the word relevance, which people understand from the IASB and the FASB's definition. And then if you were to use the word materiality, you could use it in the same way that is already well understood by reporting people at companies around the world. So you know, I mean, I'm all for like thinking hard about how we try to do this and articulate it in a way that doesn't change the underlying approach, but just changes how we're actually voicing it.
Great, thanks. I want to be mindful of time. I know we've got like a little more we're hoping to get through in this session, but Dan, please, what do you got?
Well, yeah, just quickly. I mean, I agree with many of the points that have been made, and I did want to emphasize the point that Mark Siegel made. The comment process here has been really helpful, because I at least wasn't focused on this confusion that the word materiality created, and it's great that commenters pointed that out to us, and it's a real opportunity, I think, coming from that to improve the framework. Just the only thing I would add is kind of thinking back to SASB's origins. The word materiality, to me, played a different function originally, because I think the people that conceived SASB had the idea of information that would go into SEC filings, and particularly into MD&A. And in that context, the word materiality in its US meaning was extremely important. And again, as others have pointed out, it was a big battle in those days to persuade people that there was ESG information that was material in that sense. But we moved far beyond that now with the objective of global standards and the word materiality having a different meaning in each jurisdiction. So it seems to me that perhaps what we did in this version of the conceptual framework was to redefine materiality as financial materiality, meaning decision useful. So I think it's perhaps a bit duplicative to have both of those as top level objectives in the standards. I mean, the real objective is decision useful information for investors or for capital allocation. So I can certainly see the logic or the clarity improvement of moving financially material out of the top level of the pyramid and dealing with that concept in terms of relevance to enterprise valuation and similar points. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate that history. And again, I want to kind of acknowledge that I think we know that the term has been pretty helpful historically for distinguishing from the broader sustainability reporting community and like how we're different. But the goal was never to be just a different sustainability standard setter. The goal has always been to serve as a complement to the traditional financial accounting standard setters to get the full set of information that capital markets need to make decisions around enterprise value. Suzanne said that very well. And so I think there's an opportunity to clarify that here by aligning more closely these days with the language that the FASB and the IASB use. So appreciate all of the comments. This is not the last story on this, the last chapter on this. We've got more to talk about. But Brian, I know you had a little more you wanted to talk about today. So
maybe I'll just very briefly recap a few key points that I think I've heard from a number of board members here. I think what we heard was pretty clearly with strong support. I like how you framed it, Jeff, continue to think about this, to continue to understand this, and develop a recommendation in terms of what might be a solution to address some of the challenges here. And with that said, we heard from a number of board members, and couldn't agree more with myself, just the need to be careful around communication on this to avoid misunderstandings, misperceptions. Some really good comments from Suzanne on the specific words that we use, or as Elizabeth said, the precision of the words, precision of the terms, all I think spot on, and just elevated in importance with this type of a discussion and developing solutions to address the challenge here. And then quite a strong level of support in terms of this idea of further connectivity with financial reporting standard setters, particularly the IASB. And then just a couple of other just more specific comments. I think Mark Siegel's comment around the need to reflect who the users are, investors, in future visualizations is very important. Even Dan's comment at the end there around thinking about if the use of the term, it could be duplicative in some way to decision useful. So quite a number of helpful comments from the board members. So thank you, appreciate it as always. Jeff, so we have one other issue here to discuss. Up to you as the chair, of course, but I think that if we can take maybe 15 or 20 minutes to work through this, I can try to keep my comments brief to allow more time for discussion.
Yeah, let's do that. Thanks.
So the second key issue that we're going to dive into is around the fundamental tenets, so that base of the pyramid. Market feedback has strongly supported moving the fundamental tenets from the conceptual framework to the rules of procedure, because these tenets are more closely associated with the standard setting process rather than the concepts that guide the board's decisions. This wasn't new to us in the comment period. I think this has been a kind of a long-standing known issue, but I think that we heard it pretty loud and clear from a number of respondents in the comment period, and that's why we're diving into this a bit more. So the tenets themselves will be, by and large, will be extremely important to continue to guide the process. So we're thinking about an evidence-based process, a market-informed process. The challenge, however, is that one of the 4 fundamental tenets in the exposure draft is industry-specific. In the past, we've used industry-specific as a bit more of kind of an overlay concept of something that's really important, a really important concept, and also really important to the process itself. And so you see discussion of what industry-specific means in the rules of procedure. If we were to move the fundamental tenets over to the rules of procedure, then I think we need to ask ourselves the kind of the challenging question of, have we adequately captured the importance of industry-specific in the concepts that guide the board's decisions, those concepts throughout the pyramid? Even more than industry-specific, it's just, going back to the founding of SASB on day one, it was very much about the need to connect a company's business model or activities with sustainability issues, with the sustainability impacts that result and the financial impacts that may result. So just that kind of foundational layer of importance of business model, business activities, industry, really just a pragmatic grouping of business activities. And I think that's what we want to ask ourselves here. How can we improve the concepts in the conceptual framework to really make sure we feel strong enough, clear enough around the importance of this kind of foundational concept of the SASB standards around industry specific, or at least business model or business activities. Just very importantly, and like out of an abundance of clarity, there are no considerations here around altering the importance of industry specific standards. Similarly, there are no considerations around altering the importance of an evidence-based, market-informed, transparent process, and a process that includes engagement structured by industry or sector. So that a little bit more background or context here, and then a few questions on the slide. The fundamental tenets will be crucial for continuing to guide the standard setting process. By and large, we're considering moving them over to the rules of procedure. But with that understood, thinking again about industry specific and making sure we've captured the importance of it in an accurate way throughout the conceptual framework. A few questions at the bottom around, again, just the, making sure that we capture the importance of the activities that companies conduct in the identification of disclosure topics, so the topic level characteristics. The second question is a little bit more specific to bring this to life a bit more, but when the board evaluates trade-offs between metrics that are tailored to the industry versus those at a higher level that are enable broader comparability across the market, are these concepts adequately reflected in the conceptual framework? I want to jump to a very quick example of what I mean by this. So what I've done is I've pulled two metrics, or a few metrics from two different industry standards that bring this idea of trade-offs between tailoring to the industry versus broader comparability to life. So these are scope 1 emissions-based metrics. On the left, we see what a metric from the airlines industry standard. Then it's what we refer to as just our base metric for scope 1 emissions. Very straightforward, gross global scope 1 emissions. The board did not decide that there was a need to further tailor that specific metric to the activities of the airlines industry. There certainly, are other metrics that may be tailored to the industry itself throughout the standard, but not in that scope 1 emissions metric. That then enables broader market comparability. The example on the right is from the oil and gas exploration and production industry. And you see the first metric listed, it has that base metric component, but then it expands to add an aspect around methane and an aspect around emissions limiting regulations, particularly given that the industry can operate in many different jurisdictions around the world, and regulatory regimes around emissions will vary. So that's an example where the board determined that some level of tailoring was appropriate to create decision useful information to investors. So I think this is the type of thing that we want to ask ourselves is, are these concepts to enable evaluation of the trade-offs adequately reflected in the conceptual framework? Do we have the right concepts, the right terms to have this kind of discussion? Just really, again, highlighting the importance of industry specific, especially business activities. Very last question is just, again, on alignment connectivity with financial reporting, conceptual frameworks, and keeping that as part of the conversation here. So Jeff, with all that said, appreciate the time to share out on this issue, and over to you for any of your comments and to help facilitate the discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Getting a great job teeing this up. The way, if I were to summarize the tee up, there's two parts to this. One is a very clear opportunity it's almost like an administrative thing where we're just going to move important content into the right location. So we're just going to take it from the conceptual framework and put it into our rules of procedure. That seems to make a lot of sense. There's a second part, which is just like thinking about, is there anything else that we want to improve in our characteristics that would help us both in our thinking as well as in how we communicate around that? And actually, if you could go back to that previous slide, I just want the example slide. I think it's a great example, and one of the things I wanted to point to was that, for example, even where we have the airline industry, this is an industry level identification of a topic, right? So that is something that is, in a sense, industry specific. But what we mean is that, like, this is one place where we've said, if you're in this industry, this is something that is going to be relevant to investors, right? We don't say that for all industries, for all types of metrics, but we do that identification, but not in a way that is tailored even more specifically. And then there is something that is tailored, layers on, in a sense, for the oil and gas E&P industry. And so I think one of the things that's really important there is that this is a great example of how we heard in public comment that one of the things our conceptual framework could do better is actually articulate where there are trade-offs, right? And so part of how I think about this is that if we were to, for example, drop the methane part of the E&P industry, if we were to not focus on flared hydrocarbons or other combustion, if we were to do that, I think we would sacrifice two aspects that we've already got identified: representationally faithful and the completeness of the set of metrics. But the thing is, like, we can always add more. And there needs to be some way for us to think about and to communicate where we drew the line, why we didn't include a topic in one industry, why we didn't alter it to maybe try to tailor it a little more closely in a given industry. And I think we have a lot of the wording there, but we haven't really articulated that so clearly. And it was really clear to me that we don't have the language when my students this last week in my sustainability course at the University of Texas, outstanding students, just want to give them a shout out, were describing the industry standards. They were doing group presentations, and one in particular in the healthcare sector did a great job of pointing out that there are some common metrics, there are some that are unique, and they thought that was a really interesting point, but they didn't have all the right words from our conceptual framework to actually help them even articulate that. And so I think this is a great opportunity for us to think a little more carefully about how important and in what ways industry is important to the work that we do. So I know I can monologue. Verity, please, you've been very patient.
Thanks. Well, I think it's so great to see this question follow the question of decision usefulness, because they're so intertwined in my view from the user perspective. From my, the concept of industry specific is going to be much more applicable for companies to understand the scope of what they should focus on and disclose and report on and track. That an E&P is going to track different things than a bank, and that makes a lot of sense from the cost-effective perspective. But from the user perspective, as we discussed in the materiality question, what is important or decision useful or relevant is absolutely in the eye of the beholder. And as our founder, Gene Rogers, used to say all the time, investors are not a monolith. And so different investors will hold items to be most useful to their decision making. One investor that might be a diversified investor across the entire S&P 1200 might wish to see the universal themes disclosed, like GHG emissions, scope 1 and scope 2 GHG emissions disclosed across every single company. And then maybe an energy fund analyst may want to see the more detailed information about methane and flaring and other kind of more industry specific components that could help select companies within the sector, within the industry. And so I guess I want to, acknowledge the public comment, the comments that are saying that these tenets really are much more procedural comments and support the general idea that these fundamental tenets should be considered perhaps in the document that talks about the way we develop standards, the rules of procedure. So I generally support that idea, with the exception of industry specific as a fundamental tenet, because I do think it is a principle that is more conceptual. And our human capital management project has really elevated the question of universal themes and understanding that we do have a strong rationale for places where we do have a type of general issue category or a topic that does show up in every industry, where that makes sense, that it's defensible, and where we may have missed something before, it's an opportunity for us to do more research and gather more market feedback and consider adapting our standards and improving them over time. So I would just throw out that generally I think it's, from a user perspective, I think we don't have to plug in all the holes. That is not our goal. We're not trying to create standards that have every single sustainability issue that could potentially be important. We're definitely not going there. We want to filter for the useful information, but it's not. It may mostly be industry specific, and it also may sometimes be universal issue that is more thematic, to borrow some other words. So I want to make a case for as we consider this question for this topic, that we consider it maybe in a more structural part of our pyramid here, that may not only be a procedure for the way we develop standards. It definitely guided our standards development over the last 10 years, the past 10 years, but over the next 10 years, it may not be the only procedure we use for developing standards. And within that frame, I'd like us to consider it, as a more core concept for decision making.
Thanks, Verity. As I hear some of what you have said, the way I would think about this is the full complement of standards that would be helpful to capital markets will, we think, include industry standards. It may include we already have application guidance that broadly applies to all companies. And so, and then there's the confusion sometimes that comes around, like, do we do industry specific for the sake of industry specific? And the example with the airline sector, airline industry versus oil and gas is a great example of how do we both think about these issues, the trade-offs, and articulate them so that the decisions we make when they are for a particular industry are clear why something is unique, why something is not unique, why it was specified there. So I appreciate all those comments. Lloyd, I think you're up next.
Thanks, Jeff. Just a couple quick comments on this, and just a quick reach back to the earlier materiality conversation. I think materiality is such a contested term. It would be unwise for SASB to try and develop and elaborate a unique, distinctive SASB-esque definition of materiality. So I think aligning with the IOSCO is a great strategy, so that when we use that word, we can be very clear about what we mean. And as I think you said, Jeff, maybe put some other terms around it to be clear beyond just using the word. What do we do? And the words you used, financially impactful, value relevant, decision useful, these are all words that are aimed at investors. And so when we talk about the industry structure, I think it's important to note this is the default in much of the investment industry. This is how investors are used to gathering and aggregating information and sorting through the different data streams they have to work with. So doing that makes it easier for us to be an effective partner with the investor. I would like to echo a comment that has been made in earlier, I know, internal conversations, but maybe not publicly, that we should also acknowledge industry as an imperfect organizing principle. You'll have multiple companies in an industry that do very different things. And so I think introducing the concept of the business model as a distinctive, additive term probably would enrich and more accurately describe exactly what SASB is up to. So that was my 2 bits.
Thanks, Lloyd. Helpful comments there. Appreciate that. Suzanne?
Yeah, and again, very, very briefly to say, from our conversations with the IRC when the IR framework was born, the business model was pivotal for our understanding of how to develop that framework. So I think it's only natural as a consequence of the now with the VRF that the terminology around business model becomes more prominent. Business model was also, since I'm now representing the European perspective again, business model was also adopted in the European regulation around sustainability reporting, or as it were, non-financial reporting. It still is there. And again, it's super helpful for companies, for management in companies to describe their business as a business model, to understand what are the resources they rely on, what is the output, and hence where is that value creation or erosion taking place. So just totally supportive of the business model terminology as a useful reference. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Suzanne. Appreciate those comments, the perspective. And Stephanie.
Great. Just to reflect from the reporter's side, or from the issuer or company side, Verity had mentioned that there's investors that may be more interested in cross-industry, while others may be more interested in industry-specific. And I think on the company side, similarly, there's some industries or some companies that cross the industries that we have, or may have overlap. They may fit within the software or technology industry, for example, but have a lot of overlap with, financial or retail or some other industry category. And so I think relevance to that particular business rather than trying to fit every business into one industry will serve us better. And so I like the idea of rethinking about industry specific, where it belongs, and if there's another way to describe it.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. Helpful comments. We've certainly seen large companies that operate in multiple industries have questions around what is the appropriate thing to do. I've seen some great examples of how they use multiple standards for multiple industries. But we can remove some of that confusion by making it clear that the important thing is that they're providing information that's relevant to investors, and that's going to relate to business model. And that means if they operate in multiple industries, there's going to be more that they can communicate that's going to be helpful to the investors. So yeah, great comments. Appreciate that. And Mark, and then I think we're probably close to time.
Yeah, Jeff, sorry, I'm going to be very brief, therefore, right? First of all, saying that I'm also very supportive of, the business model emphasis. And the other comment that I wanted to make is, if we want to still also talk about the industry specificity, I think also under the heading of prevalence, I think there's already a mention of, how do we actually determine, what the issues are that we need to look at. And also there, if an issue is, prevalent within an industry, it is one that we would address, right? If it meets the other topic characteristics versus across industry issues. And I think, we could actually have both of these angles also highlighted, maybe even stronger than we do now under prevalence. That was the addition I wanted to make.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I think that's a great point, and really like a great place to kind of wrap up in some ways is just to think about how both topics that we talked about today really are illustrating that embedded in the work that we do is a lot of the information that we need to guide our process and to communicate around it. And this is a great opportunity not to change a very clear approach that we take to standard setting and the mission that we have. It's clear the work that we do, and we want to continue to execute on that. But again, like a great opportunity to align our language with the traditional financial accounting standard setters and more clearly articulate around how and in what ways we are trying to embed relevance to decision usefulness into our work, the role of business models and business activities as part of that, and how the complement, the set of standards that SASB produces is going to facilitate ultimately the production of information that's what the capital markets need. So, Brian, any final comments you want there?
No, I think that was a really great spot-on recap, Jeff, just how important this issue is here. And I think we saw widespread support from the board on both acknowledgement and understanding of how crucial this concept of business model activities industry is, not just for the process, also for the concepts that guide the board's decisions. And I don't think we know, the board knows exactly what this could look like in the future, but I think we heard a couple indications from Mark Basson and his comments and a couple other indications from other board members of possible solutions. So really helpful discussion from my perspective. And if you don't mind, Jeff, I can just wrap up the session here. So again, helpful discussion, project team to keep incorporating board views into next steps and moving the project forward. We'll look to develop kind of a working draft of the conceptual framework in order to really put the words down on paper and what solutions or kind of our various options at our disposal might look like for addressing these challenges. And then third, and very important, just calling in again the overall landscape, particularly the IFRS Foundation and its technical readiness working group, and just see what value we can add there, and what and continuing engagements with that group in the context of the possible upcoming ISSB. So all very important stuff, very positive stuff, and just exciting to be where we are right now, pushing the thinking forward on sustainability accounting standards and the best conceptual framework possible that can guide a board's decision on such standards. So Jeff, again, thank you to you and the full board members for a really robust, helpful discussion. I enjoyed it, and I will turn it over to you, Jeff, to help move into the next session.
Great, thank you, Brian. Appreciate that. And so what we have up next is an update on the project related to tailings management and extractives. So for that, we're going to invite Lynn back. Lynn, we know you're batting double duty, today. And so appreciate you taking the time to give us an update on where we are in this project and then talk about some next steps.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it. So for this session, we're going to give an update, as Jeff mentioned, around the tailings management project in extractives. As Jeff mentioned, our project lead, Greg Waters, couldn't be here today, so I'll be providing an update on behalf of him to the board from the technical staff. And we can dive right into this. A reminder around this project is we initiated this standard setting project in the wake of especially several failures of tailings storage facilities in recent years, and seeing that there was evolving investor interest as well as increased corporate disclosures around this topic, and recognizing that this very financially impactful issue was not comprehensively reflected in our current standards. So the standard setting project has been out with that objective to evaluate what the appropriate revisions and additions to the metals and mining as well as cooperation standards are to address and measure the way that companies manage tailings storage facilities. As a quick reminder, the project was launched in late 2019, and in early 2021 in March, we wrapped up the public comment period on the exposure drafts, and equally appreciated the comments that we received. And in this last 2 quarters, the staff and the board have been factoring in those feedback to develop the final standards update, kind of some revisions around those based on feedback and further market consultation. And today in this session, wanted to just recap kind of the 3 main areas of revisions on the exposure draft that technical staff recommends for the final standards update. And equally, we've been deliberating with board members in this past period. So these 3 areas is first, updating the tailings storage facilities inventory table, one of the proposed metrics, to provide more decision useful information based on feedback from investors, especially that we received during the public comment period. Second is to increase further alignment on terminology, the scope of disclosure, as well as some concepts with the global industry standard on tailings management. And then third is based on feedback, we've clarified and reduced the scope of the narrative disclosure requirement, so qualitative metric that was included in the exposure drafts to improve the understandability of the metrics. So dive in a little bit on what this means in terms of revisions to the exposure draft out for public comment. So first, when we look at this, is the table that was one of the proposed metrics, and there's kind of 3 categories of revisions to the table that staff is recommending. First is around the theme of improving decision usefulness. Second is around further alignment with the global industry standard on tailings management. And then this last piece is around kind of options to summarize for some of these disclosures. So I'll go in the next few slides on what this means specifically. So first, around the improving the decision usefulness, this is based on feedback we received during public comment around just what are some of the elements that was originally in the table. And we can look at the first 2 items kind of in complementing each other. With what we heard from the public comments, one is a recommendation to remove construction year, one of the elements of the table, and instead replace it with construction method. The feedback that we received is that construction year is not really a good to kind of measure linked to understanding risk profile of a storage facility, as they're usually built in stages, and so that kind of initial year isn't necessarily the most useful information. And furthermore, the feedback was instead how the tailings storage facility is built. That construction method or raising method is much more decision useful information for understanding the risk profile. So that's one revision that staff is proposing for the table. And additionally, staff is proposing adding maximum permitted storage, facility storage capacity, as well as the current amount of tailings stored. Investors had expressed that there is interest in general around more forward-looking metrics, And then the kind of capacity and percent of capacity and use are helpful metrics around further understanding risk profile of how a tailings storage facility may change over time. So this is that first category of revisions that staff is proposing to improve the decision usefulness of information in this table. Now, turning into the second category is further increasing alignment with the GISTM. As the kind of in our conceptual framework, a key characteristics around our metric development is around aligning with industry standards to improve also around the cost effectiveness of preparation of disclosures. So this is in the table where we have a couple of terminologies as examples that it's not changing any intended meaning, but just to use the exact same words and terminology as in the GISTM. So you can see that in columns H and I, the proposals here. And equally, while it's not shown on the slide and won't be discussed further in detail today, there are some other examples throughout the technical protocols that we are also recommending just to improve further alignment in terminology and definition. And we believe this will help with kind of the usefulness of the standards and consistency with preparation. Then turning to this third category around the recommended revisions to the table is around guidance on these two different elements of material findings as well as mitigation measures. I wanted to just note foremost that the material findings and mitigation measures, they are also aligned with disclosures that are noted in the GISTM as well. What is recommended is not any changes to the table itself in terms of the binary yes/no disclosure, and instead it is adding an additional optional guidance for companies when the answer is yes to further then provide a summary of the relevant findings related to the mitigation measures. This was based on feedback, kind of two different feedback that the narrative disclosure would be helpful to understand, what does this really mean and improve the decision usefulness, and equally feedback, to completely change the table to include full narrative disclosure would also kind of compromise the usefulness of the table. So we were finding kind of the middle position on how to encourage that disclosure in context, which also is in general consistent with our standards application guidance to provide context to help understand the disclosure information, but also keep the table kind of a quick, easy, decision useful tool for investors. So that kind of wraps up the three main areas around the tailing storage facility table that staff is recommending for revision. And then the other big area for revision based on feedback is at the qualitative metric. And these revisions really aim to balance some concerns we heard from preparers regarding that they were interpreting it to mean disclosure of confidential and proprietary information, and then equally with some investor input around the desire for how to help make this narrative disclosure even more decision useful for them. So around these two narrative qualitative metrics, first, around the first row is we are recommending updating the phrasing, asking for description of tailings management systems and governance structure to a summary of the systems and governance structure. This is in response to, I think there was company feedback that the description, they would interpret that scope to include proprietary and sensitive information. And then equally investor views that a summary and overview would be also sufficient. So when we check back with the market around this, it's like the parts that preparers were concerned about confidentiality was not necessarily a specific piece and investors were seeking. And then on the second piece around summary of, originally the qualitative metric was around the summary of the emergency preparedness and response plans. And we heard kind of overwhelmingly that a summary would be quite a voluminous disclosure and probably include a lot more detail than the key decision useful pieces that investors are looking for. And through further conversations on determining kind of the approach on how these plans are developed would be where it would be most decision useful. So we're recommending that the metric, the wording be updated, and it's not shown in this slide, but of course the underlying technical protocol are also clarified to provide further information on what is intended through these this qualitative disclosures. So that wraps up the set of revisions that the staff is recommending for the board to consider for the standards update, and wanted to just take a second to talk through what does it look like next for this project. At the next step is, so the staff and board have deliberated these changes, and staff is incorporating this into an updated draft of the standard and basis for conclusion. The board will be reviewing this after this board meeting to further see how this all fits together. And staff's recommendation at that point then is to proceed to the final board vote to approve final updates to the metals and mining as well as coal operation standards with these recommended changes. And if that final vote proceeds forward and we have the standards update, the goal is then to publish these updated standards as well as basis for conclusions before the end of this year. So at this point, I'm going to go back to just the slide that summarizes the key revisions and open it up for the board to see if there is any kind of further feedback or comments on the revisions at this time, and then if there's any questions on the next steps. So.
Thanks, Lynn. So I would just maybe note that this is a great example, I think, of how, when we think of the role of our fundamental tenets around how we do what we do, one of the things is transparency. So that includes the public comment period, so that there's an opportunity to hear feedback from our stakeholders on the proposed changes before we make them. And so I think this is a great example of how we listen, and sometimes what we hear is that there isn't an obvious solution, but there is an opportunity to still rethink and maybe improve on the margins some of what it is that we're proposing to update. And so appreciate the overview here and sort of walking us toward the last mile or so on this project. So I want to go ahead and turn to Verity.
I too wanted to just point out this project is such a good example of us, really living our conceptual framework too, taking the global industry standard on tailings management and really whittling it down to the decision useful elements that we've confirmed with the market, thanks to really great market outreach and really solid feedback from both investors and companies in the two industries that we're looking to apply this standard. So I just wanted to say that it's so great to see this progress along the lines of being near to completion, and I look forward to the final proposal.
Great, thanks, Verity.
Yeah, and Verity, I'm in violent agreement here. I think this has been a good story of us coming in. The industry was trying to coalesce. We came in with a little different view, and I think both groups got better for it, and certainly investors will have a great amount of comparable information that'll help them risk assess their investments. So it all in all has been a good case study. So thanks.
Great, thanks, Kurt.
Mark?
Just a quick point. I agree with both Verity and Kurt. I think it's a good example of how we, through the comment period and the outreach, evaluated trade-offs between cost effectiveness and keeping things decision useful. So I think it is really living the conceptual framework. So the feedback generally on the tabular presentation, can you give a couple of words on that? Because I know one of the things we were concerned about when we initially proposed this was it's a big table. Can you just give a little background on what the feedback was on that?
Yes, definitely, Mark. I think generally, my understanding is it's like a welcome and positive feedback around the tabular presentation. It was noted a couple areas, for example, its elaboration on the material findings is make sure, since it is already so many different columns and variables, that if it's narrative disclosure, don't further embed it in here so that it becomes a table of essentially paragraphs of text, but having it be more like the specific, either quantitative or binary content is the most helpful. But making sure we don't lose that context and welcome that additional context outside of the table itself.
Yeah, and I think I agree with your recommendation there, where it goes to narrative, the optional narrative to try to explain the things in the table, put that outside the table. I agree with that too. But great job. Agree with the recommendations. Thank you.
Great, thanks,
Thanks,
Mark.
I would also note that there are always trade-offs. At the University of Texas, we have a center. It's called the Salem Center. It's kind of a policy center in the business school, and its tagline is "No solutions, only trade-offs," which I actually kind of love because it resonates so much with like the challenges. And I think one thing that we saw here is, for example, in trying to align for cost effectiveness purposes, and given that this was like an industry initiative that seems to be helpful to investors, in the context of being an operator doing a review, then the GITSM identified material findings as something that they kind of lay out and ask the companies to articulate. And we know that we don't set standards around entity-specific thresholds, and so we can align. Some of the feedback that we heard is like, are you asking for something that's different, or are you asking for something that's the same? And sometimes when you read the word material in the context of disclosures to investors, it may seem different to companies than in the context of doing a review as an operator of a mine as part of compliance with the GITSM. So I think that as I've seen, and I know we didn't really focus on it here, but my understanding is that in the guidance, it's very clear that when we say material, it's for alignment purposes that we're using their language, and we're pointing to that so that we can keep the content similar in that respect. So just appreciate the thoughtful response to the public comments that came in, asking for alignment, but clarity around that and that outcome. So looks like we don't have any other board members wanting to weigh in. I know we're a little over time on this particular topic because you got a slow start or a late start. So we'll go ahead and anything else you want to say, Lynn, before we move on?
No, thanks, Jeff, for noting that. And then just wanted to note that, yeah, today in this session, we did not get into the technical protocols, but certainly that is where further clarity on the guidance is being provided. And then if there is any further also public, just any of the public watching us questions, please contact Greg Waters. His contact will be included in the board slide, and he can provide further details as a project lead. But otherwise, I'll turn it over to you and Emily for the next session. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn. So we will watch for the updated version of the standard and a basis for conclusions going forward. So appreciate that. Okay, Emily, welcome. So we're going to turn to systemic risk and asset management, another project that is post public comment period, and where we have an opportunity to just hear back what we have heard and learned from the public comment period, and then talk about what the plan is with our next steps. And I'll just note that this is Emily Gaston's first public board meeting. So I know that you've been on the team for a bit now, but welcome to your first public board meeting, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Jeff. Yep, so as Jeff mentioned, I'll be taking you through systemic risk in asset management. So in this session's objectives, I will talk you through the public comment letters we received. We'll go through staff's recommendations for the standard update, and then we'll review next steps. So just to recap, this project stemmed from evolving industry and regulatory trends relating to systemic risk in the asset management industry. As a result, staff decided to reevaluate the disclosure topic and the associated metrics relating to the systemic risk management topic and within the asset management and custody standard, to really see how we could improve the decision usefulness of the information within the disclosure topic and metrics. And just to highlight, this project doesn't affect the systemic risk management disclosure topic or the associated metrics in commercial banks, insurance, and the investment banking and brokerage standards. So to give you some historical context, this project launched in December 2019. It went through a targeted consultation period, after which the board decided to, preliminary decided to remove the first metric, which related to liquidity categories of open-ended fund assets, which was in line with the SEC Rule 22E4, which had since been rescinded. After this, we drafted the exposure draft and put this out to public commentary period, which I'll take you through in the following slides. So just to highlight, the grey box shows you the current disclosure topic and the associated metrics that staff are recommending to remove. And the basis for conclusion includes that the disclosure topic doesn't reflect relevant sustainability impacts. So this is when we think about the potential negative societal impacts that could actually stem from systemic risk in asset management. The metrics are not aligned with the current regulatory narrative around systemic risk in the industry. So this really speaks to the Financial Stability Oversight Committee revising its approach from entity-based to activities-based metrics in asset management. The next one is in relation to changes in regulatory reporting requirements in the US. So this again is related to the first metric, which we spoke about in the previous slide, where the SEC actually rescinded this rule on the percentage of open-ended funds assets under management by category of liquidity classification. And overall, we received a lot of feedback that this topic and the metrics do not provide decision useful information and could potentially be misleading or confusing to investors. And just to wrap it all up, we noticed that whenever we looked at the asset management reports, many of them were actually omitting this disclosure topic. So we put this out for public comments earlier in the year from March to June, and we received 8 responses, 3 from industry associations, 2 from companies, and 3 from other interested parties, which included an assurance practitioner, a consultant, and an individual. So overall, this was consistent with market input staff had received throughout the project, and staff felt it did not present any significant new information nor significantly alter the total mix of information available to and considered by the board beforehand. But with that said, the letters are really helpful in helping us validate our conclusions in regard to the exposure draft. So to delve into more details in regard to the comment letters, we asked 3 questions. So we asked, do you support the proposed removal of the first accounting metric? Again, this is to do with the percentage of open-ended fund assets under management by category of liquidity classification. We received 5 letters in support, and this largely echoed our rationale from the basis for conclusions, and it really talked about how the SEC had rescinded this rule, so no longer aligned. We received 2 letters in opposition. These more generally talked about the importance of liquidity risk, but didn't reference the actual metric posed in the question. The second question was, do you support the proposed removal of the systemic risk management disclosure topic as currently covered in the standards? We received 4 letters in support. Again, these largely echoed the rationale from the basis for conclusions. So it talked about the lack of sustainability rationale and the argument about the role of asset managers to financial stability. And we received 3 letters in opposition, and they talked about fiduciary duty and the importance to incorporate ESG factors in investment management. The third question was, do you believe that the social impacts associated with enterprise risk management are reasonably likely to be financially material to a typical financial institution in the asset management and custodies activities industry? We received 2 letters in support. These letters talked about the importance of enterprise risk management to manage stakeholder impacts, but they didn't provide us with any concrete actionable suggestions to move this forward in any way. And we received 2 letters of opposition, and these questioned whether the activities of asset managers could pose risks of sufficiently high probability and magnitude to give rise to significant and widespread negative social impacts. So overall, staff recommends that the board update the asset management and custodies activities by approving the changes in the proposed exposure drafts. So that means the removal of the systemic risk management topic and the associated metrics. Just to summarise, the public comment feedback was consistent with market input staff had received throughout the project, and it really helped to validate our prior research consultation. And that analysis has led to the proposed changes in the exposure draft. Staff don't believe there are any significant outstanding unresolved questions that are within the scope of this project. And happy to take any questions from the board.
Thanks, Emily. I appreciate you walking us through the feedback that we heard. I think that's it's another example. So we've really, we've walked through kind of 3 examples of what we can hear back during public comment and how much it can cause us to sort of rethink. And we're sort of going in reverse order of the one where there was the most rethinking to less rethinking, with respect to tailings management, but some, and then actually like relatively little, it sounds like at this point in terms of the staff recommendation. So appreciate you walking us through that, and I'll go ahead and pass it over to Elizabeth.
Hi, thank you for doing that. I agree with everything that was said. I just wanted to ask a question about the public comments, because we had industry associations, companies, and then the other interested parties, and I didn't see investors listed here. So and I don't remember to what extent investors had weighed in on this before. So could you just, for the purposes of reminding me and for other people who don't see investors on this list, just give an overview of how they've weighed in or commented in the past? I know you're new to this, so that might be unfair to you, but.
Well, I would say from the initial public consultation, there was definitely investor weigh in there. But also the companies listed are actually asset managers, so you would get the investor side from them also. And yeah, I think that's all I can tell you. I don't know if Brian has anything else to add, because I know he's a lot more historical context than I do, but that would be the 2 that are obvious to me.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's spot on, Emily. I believe 1 or 2 of those asset management issuers explicitly stated that they're representing the views from both the investment side of the house and the issuer side. So that's one just quick comment to the extent that helps or does not help Elizabeth. I think the bigger point, though, is what Emily got at around investor engagement earlier on in the project, kind of leading up to the exposure draft. That I think pointed to 2 things. One, that really confirmed the proposed change in the exposure draft, the removal of the project, but also expressed interest in kind of this broader question around social impacts, around liquidity risk and so forth that we've discussed in the past. And that's where we viewed this as an interesting issue to further explore and understand, particularly through kind of our ongoing pre-agenda research and consultation. We did not take the view, at least the staff, and I think it's consistent with what we've heard from the board in the past. We discussed this leading up to the exposure draft, that issue was feasible enough for us to really alter the scope of this project, or at least include that as kind of the objective of this project. And that's why we took the view that moving forward to update the standard with the removal of the topic is the most feasible solution, but continue to monitor that kind of bigger, related, but a little bit of different question around social impacts arising out of maybe like liquidity risk management among funds, for example. So I hope that helps at least a bit, Elizabeth. Maybe just one last comment is also we always encourage public comment letters from everybody, all of our stakeholders, and especially primary users, investors, and then the issuers themselves. And I think this is what we typically observe in more of the formal public comment periods, is less in the way of kind of industry analysts issuing a comment letter on behalf of their organization, but making themselves available for consultations throughout the process. So maybe just one kind of contextual observation as well. Does that help, Elizabeth?
It does help. Thank you.
Good question.
Yeah, thank you. So Verity?
I'll add on my own answer to Elizabeth's question, which is there was no shortage of outreach attempts on behalf of SASB. I know, for example, that we repeatedly marketed the open comment period of this project, both to the Standards Advisory Group and Investor Advisory Group and other sort of investor audiences, which could have weighed in, especially on that third question of, is there a different way we could get at a potential solution to measure the social impacts of systemic risk for companies in this industry? And nobody took our offer, but there was no shortage of attempts. And so maybe that is just a way to confirm that this, the best path forward here, which is to improve the standard based on the market feedback we received, which also has not only the benefit of making this more decision useful and more applicable, or you're going to get the right name or
cost effective
quality from our conceptual framework pyramid that I'm going to remember. What is it?
Cost effective.
Thank you. But it also has a benefit of making it look a little bit more internationally applicable, right? To remove the anchor from a specific piece of SEC US regulation, which never actually came to fruition. So here's a time when our forward-looking standards were a little bit ahead of the game, and we did our best attempt, but here's our chance to improve the standard. So that's a lot of supportive comments for where this project is, and again, I look forward to the final basis for conclusion that we can get this out to the market in a more improved fashion.
Thanks, Verity. Dan?
Yeah, thanks. And just a quick comment. I certainly agree with this proposal and support it, but I just think it underscores the fact that while so much of our work consists of identifying new or emerging issues since codification that have to be added to the standards, the other side of the coin of keeping the standards useful is to look for things that turn out not to be decision useful. This is kind of striking that that's one of the early things that we do here, but I hope people would be aware of our sensitivity to that and point out places where we ought to think about removal. So thanks.
Appreciate that, Dan. I'm a big believer that the best solution is not always to add something, but sometimes it's to take away something. So it seems to be the case in this particular instance. Any other thoughts from the board members? So maybe Emily, do you want to talk through what the next steps are?
Yep, sure. Thanks, Jeff. I'll wrap up here. So the next steps, the first would be to review the updated basis for conclusions, and this would incorporate any considerations and deliberations of the public comments. The second would be to proceed to the final board vote to actually approve the update to the asset management and custody standard that we talked about today, and including the basis for conclusions, and then last to publish the revised version of the asset management and custody activity standard. And that's all from me. So thank you.
Thanks, Emily. So just for those that are listening in today as well. So what's going to happen for both the systemic risk and asset management project as well as tailings management is that the board will be getting a a revised version of those standards, a proposed revised version that we will ballot, that will have with it a basis for conclusions, which explains the reasoning for the change, and so we'll be doing all of that, not online here, but the outcomes of those voting processes will be public, and then the basis for conclusions and the revised standard will be made public as well. And so more to come on that, but that will sort of wrap us for today. So Emily, appreciate you being with us today, and again, welcome to the team. And with that, maybe Brian, is there anything that you want to say to kind of like wrap up this first section from today?
No, I think you and Emily captured it well. So look forward to the next steps here and moving this forward. What it certainly sounds like to the finish line on this project. So exciting developments, and thank you, Jeff, and to the full board for your comments and input and decisions throughout the project. So that's it for me. Thanks, Jeff.
Great, thanks, Brian. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a 15-minute break, and we will come back at 1:45. So a 15-minute break, and just invite anybody who's listening in to hang in there with us, and then we'll come back and continue on with our board meeting in 15 minutes. Thank you. Okay, I'd like to go ahead and welcome everybody back from our break, and looking forward to the second part of our board meeting for today. So hopefully everybody, all the board members are back from their well-deserved break after a very thoughtful and thought-provoking and engaged set of topics this morning. So we've got a couple more topics to go through this afternoon, and the first up relates to the alternative meat and dairy project, which is an ongoing standard-setting project that has only recently kind of kicked off the ground, but we've got an update on that, and so for that we're turning to Devin Bonney, who is the sector analyst and the project lead on this, and so I'd like to welcome her. Devin, welcome. Oh, you may be on mute.
Thanks, Jeff. Hopefully you can hear me now.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that we said it at least once today. You know, we haven't said you're still not muted, but like we at least did get in the you're still on mute. So thank you for joining us today, and go ahead, and the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Jeff, and excited to be here today and share an update on the alternative meat and dairy project. So just as a reminder, today's objectives are we'll be reviewing additional evidence and market input that we received specifically on the processed food industry, and we're formally seeking a board vote to expand the scope of the alternative products standard setting project to include the processed food industry. As a reminder, the food and beverage sector is rapidly evolving to meet a growing demand for more sustainable food through alternative products. And this emerging issue is affecting the value creation for various food and beverage companies and industries, and is currently not specifically addressed in the industry standards. And so the project objective for the research project is to evaluate the scope of ESG impacts and financial impacts of these products and determine if there was an opportunity to increase the decision usefulness of specific industry standards through a standard setting project. We kicked off this research back in February of 2020, and we've been doing research over the past year and a half or so to look at, again, really what are those ESG impacts that alternative meat and dairy products have across the food and beverage sector, and what are the financial impacts. And back in the May board meeting, the board voted to launch a standard setting project that was specifically focused on the meat, poultry, and dairy industry and the food retailer and distributor industry. The board also discussed that they would like to further evaluate evidence of investor interest, prevalence, and financial impact for the processed food industry. So over the past few months, we've been busy collecting that information, and I'll sharing a summary of that today as well, and then formally seeking a board vote. So one of the pieces of evidence that we've looked at over the past few months to determine if there was increased investor interest for processed foods was we looked at data from earnings calls, and this is data from earnings calls of the top or largest 10 processed food companies by market cap. And really, we actually weeded out 2 of those companies because they were not likely to have strategies related to alternative products because they were making spices or condiments and were not likely to have a strategy. So this is the top 8 companies that are likely to have an alternative product strategy. And as you can see, back in 2018, there were a few companies that mentioned in their prepared remarks, mentioned process or alternative products, and that number grew to 7 in 2019 and continues to grow into 2020. And then we also saw an increase in analyst questions between 2019 and 2020. And we have data for the first half of 2021. And this is just one indication to say that we think that alternative products are increasingly of interest to investors as they've been increasingly mentioned or discussed in earnings calls. We also looked, this is just some examples of what companies are saying in earnings calls. So Danone mentioned at 2020 that they had a 15% growth rate of these products and that their revenue reached 2.2 billion euros. And again, increasing a percentage of, pretty significant percentage of sales of that essential dairy products division. Nestle similarly mentioned that Plant-based was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and they see this reaching 20 billion business going forward, accelerating by double-digit growth. We also looked at annual reports, and it should be mentioned that while the number of companies that mention alternative products in their annual reports has remained consistent since 2018, the number of times this is mentioned by those companies has increased substantially since that time frame, indicating that for companies that have an alternative product strategy, it's increasingly relevant for them to report and communicate to their investors. So again, these are just two examples that we saw in annual reports, one by Unilever, that they're investing heavily in developing new plant-based products, that Hellmann's, which is a mayonnaise, only grew by high single digits, whereas plant-based brands grew by over 70% in that year. And they also highlighted that this was a risk and opportunity for them, that animal-based agriculture represented a significant percentage of their GHG emissions, and they're working to reduce that through their alternative product strategy. And Nestle, again, reported percent growth over the calendar year. And this just indicates that through those earning calls and annual reports that this is increasingly of importance for processed food companies to communicate to their investors. And we saw an increase in investor interest as well after the May board meeting, when investors reached out and they were disappointed that processed foods was not included in the standard setting project, mentioning that this alternative products were an urgent issue for companies and that they're a key industry and likely to be affected by the growing consumer demand. And we also saw an increase in prevalence and financial impacts over the past year, both through increased product offerings that companies have, as well as increase from demand, not just from end consumers, but from business customers of processed food companies like schools and hospitals that have to provide food in cafeteria. They're increasingly demanding more plant-based or alternative products to sell in those settings. We also saw a potential increase in government action, including meat taxes in the EU and incentives to eat more plant-based products in China, which just indicates that there could be a regulatory risk in the future for processed food companies, indicating that this could have even more significant financial impact in the future. And so with that, we have two discussion topics for the board today. First, does the board agree that there is sufficient evidence to warrant standard setting for the processed food industry? And then secondly, does the board agree with our recommendation to add processed food to the scope of the current alternative product standard setting project? The benefits of adding to the current standard setting project is that it will allow us to get a holistic view to assess the issue across this sector. It would leverage efficiencies as we conduct market outreach and mitigate market confusion by just having one project. There are a few drawbacks that I'm happy to walk through, including potential timing and scope and additional complexities. Just as you have more industries, the project becomes more complex, but we do think that the benefits outweigh the drawbacks. So I'll just pause on the first discussion topic question and open any board questions or insight.
Thanks, Devin. So I appreciate you teeing this up, and I think this has been one of the industries where there's been a lot of discussion around this as this project has, as an initial research project developed. There's always seems to have been like a little bit of uncertainty around this, and it seems like in some ways the balance of evidence may have tipped the other direction. And so I'm curious what the fellow board members are thinking, but I want to make sure that I understand the evidence that's provided and really kind of how to interpret it. So it sounds like when you look at earnings calls, when you look at the reports, the annual reports, that we're seeing increased references to alternative meat and dairy type products. But it seems like, and tell me if I'm interpreting this incorrectly, I mean, it does seem like you explicitly said this with the annual reports. I think it's looked like it was maybe also true for the earnings calls, that it's pretty much like a growing issue for some companies in the industry, and that not only is it sort of like a steady state sort of issue for some companies, it seems to be not on the radar at all. Or am I misunderstanding some of that? So can you help me think about it? I think it weighs on this kind of like notion of like prevalence in particular, I suppose.
So that was true for annual reports, that it was the same companies, the same 3 companies were increasingly mentioning it. So it was increasingly of importance to their businesses. In the earnings calls, however, we did see an increase in the number of companies that were being asked about alternative products or including it in their prepared remarks over the course of those 3 years. So I would say the earnings calls data, which I believe should be in the board book, include or state how many companies were asked, but it was a pretty large percentage of those top 8 were either had it in their prepared remarks or were asked about it in 1 or more earnings calls throughout the year.
Okay, yeah, it looked to me like that might have been sort of 3 of 7 kind of companies all the way across, but I may have misunderstood those references and what would qualify as a mention. But that's just like one of the things that I think, you know, and we said this actually earlier today, that industries are one way to group business model, but the processed food industry is an interesting one, and one where, you know, I guess, you know, as we think about this project, then I think it's really important to mention that this at most is talking about moving forward with thinking about adapting the processed foods industry standard, not sort of pre-adjudicating what the outcome of that might be, but actually to, you know, to engage in the due process that could inform our decision making. So I just think like that's one of the things that we'll need to think about, is to the extent that, you know, if this is in the standard, you know, is that generally going to be helpful for companies that are in the industry? Or are we going to find more companies saying that like doesn't really fit their business model and sort of like having to deal with that complexity versus the alternative of not having guidance that might be actually quite useful for them and hitting on an issue that is of interest to investors. So I think that's it's not entirely clear to me at this point, but again, like this is not the point where we're trying to decide what the revision to the standard should be, but really just whether or not there's enough evidence to suggest that there's an opportunity to potentially improve the standards.
Yeah, and that's a good distinction, Jeff. And I think I forgot to mention this early, but the research project was really doing our due diligence on understanding the overarching ESG impacts and financial impacts. But standard setting really digs down into, okay, how do we revise or add disclosure topics and associated metrics to best measure performance? And it could be, as we do this, that it's determined that there isn't a way to improve the decisional usefulness of processed foods. But we think for now, there is sufficient evidence to warrant further investigation into that through standard setting activities.
Okay, I appreciate that. That's helpful for me. So also, like any other comments from board members? Maybe I should have taken roll before we started the second part. It's possible that no one is there. Oh, my trusty co-chair, my co-pilot is there. Verity, over to you.
I'll just say I do think the evidence is strong, especially of investor interest, and we might see prevalence come on more as we see more of this investor interest come through. In particular, I'm thinking about at least one newly launched investor collaborative engagement group, which will be focusing on the food industry and the emissions generated by this industry. And so as more portfolios and investors are looking to understand the sources of greenhouse gas emissions in their portfolios, I think they're coordinating more investor engagement coalitions, industry by industry. So I expect we might see more prevalence of mentions in annual reports, at least if not earnings calls, although that was a very helpful analysis. So I'm supportive of this change and addition.
Yeah, Lloyd? Thanks, Verity.
Yeah, and I'm also strongly supportive. I think it's having a conversation with someone about this topic, and their question was, well, are we just sort of trying to get companies to disclose good growth businesses, right? Because you reported the 20% growth rates. But I think there's an important function that's being met here. One of the things the SASB standards, I think, do exceptionally well is help investors understand situations where markets may be underreacting to something significant that's happening in, for want of a better word, the real world. And here, the sustainability and systems work around meat alternatives is pretty powerful. And we've got the companies now talking about it and participating very actively. So even though this is a relatively small piece of global market cap, this is something that's systemically impactful and could become much more relevant later. So it's a very appropriate thing to ask for disclosure on. And the specific proposal putting this in the packaged foods industry, I personally feel like this is where it would have the greatest impact. And given the prevalence of that ecosystem, and it's literally an industry every single person touches. So I think this is a powerful example of some of the positive things that the SASB standards can do in terms of bringing better disclosure to systemically important activities early so investors are more aware of them.
All right, thanks a lot. I appreciate the perspective. Definitely, you and Verity can certainly weigh in and share that investor perspective that is very helpful, in particular on this particular project. Kurt.
Yeah, I think maybe the hesitation for all of us jumping in is we're all pretty much in support of this, and usually we use these chances to take pot shots, but I do think maybe echoing a little bit on what Lloyd said also is that this is not just identify your new hot products. Certainly there are long-term risks and potential changes in the way food is considered. If net zero becomes bigger and bigger, then the carbon footprint of the foods we eat may well be both a great opportunity and a significant risk for companies. And so much as energy consumption and other things have begun to change the profiles of risk and opportunity for companies, this could also for this industry. So I do think this is a look forward into an area where it would not just be filling a market niche, but really preparing companies for the future of potential either regulation or financial impacts. And as such, it's a good time for this.
Great, thanks, Kurt. Appreciate that, especially coming a corporate perspective there as well. Other thoughts from board members on this? Certainly okay if not. I know that there's two discussion topics here, so not to cut off conversation on this one, we can definitely come back to it if somebody has something that they didn't address. But on the second discussion topic, here I do think even if we're pretty clear that this makes sense, we want to move forward with further due diligence in considering whether or not there's an opportunity to improve the standards. I think how we do that is not as obvious and important important question. So could you just spend a little more time here kind of talking about if we are to approve a standard setting project for the alternative products, why it makes sense, for alternative products in the processed foods industry, why it makes sense to go ahead and include it with the existing project.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that including it in the same project will allow us to look at this issue holistically across also meat, poultry, dairy, and food retailers. So combining that value chain and how these products are interacting at each point in that, which I think is important. It will leverage efficiencies of our staff as we reach out to different companies. There are some companies that may play in one or more spaces, and so getting their understanding of how it impacts their business could be really helpful. And mitigate market confusion. If we have many projects on our website related to alternative products, it could get confusing and people might be unsure what we're trying to achieve and why we have two separate projects. Again, the potential drawbacks are that timing, just as you add more industries, it may be more complex, or the solutions may be more easily identified for one or more industries. And so the timing of outcomes, is something that we'll have to consider, as well as the complexities. But I think that the benefits outweigh the drawbacks, and we can work with the board on how to best deal with those drawbacks if and when they arise, on timing mostly.
So yeah, just kind of thinking about that, like, I mean, how realistic is it that you think it might take longer to develop? It's assuming that we see an opportunity and we think that there's going to be some disclosure topic instead of metrics that would improve the standard for processed foods. How realistic is it that might actually take a bit longer to kind of work through than for the other standards or for the other industries?
It's hard to say, and right now I don't anticipate it taking a lot longer. We have very similar questions for processed foods, about how it relates to supply chain impacts and product diversification for processed foods as well as food retailers. And so I think that's a benefit in that we have similar questions to date, and it's just a question of what feedback we get from the market that will determine how quickly we can move forward with all or the appropriate industries. But I don't anticipate this time taking a significantly longer amount of time if we were to include processed foods in that standard setting project.
Great. Any thoughts from the board on whether or not it makes sense to do this? Nope. Got Stephanie. Stephanie?
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense to combine them. And I think in addition to the relatively small anticipated timing impact, I think it's useful to have this additional topic and additional consultations that might actually inform the rest of our standard setting. So I think it'll end up with potentially a better result across multiple industries.
Thanks, Stephanie. Definitely appreciate that. Any other views? As Kurt noted, we can be supportive or contrarian. I know it's our nature to provoke, to interrogate, but Mark.
Yeah, I'll just be supportive. Stephanie nailed it. I think it's easier to leverage everything across multiple things, and you might learn something in one industry that you might not have learned otherwise. And so I think it makes sense to include it in both.
Right. Thanks, Mark. I would note that when we made the decision for the initial standard setting projects, we definitely explicitly said we should continue research on this and decide whether or not, because we weren't sure that we were in the right position to make a decision at that time, and definitely didn't want that to drag on too long before we made a call, in part because there would be a bigger timing gap if there was a longer delay before reaching a decision. So definitely appreciate all the work that you've done to try to address the previous board concerns around the financial impact, as well as getting at some of the prevalence issues. And appreciate the board's discussion today. That certainly has helped me to see that seems to make sense to move forward. So as I understand it, it sounds like there's largely agreements to both add to initiate the standard setting project and to add it to the existing standard setting project that was already underway. So I think what we'll do now, unless there's anything that you want to weigh in on before this, Devin, or any response?
Nothing else for me. Looking forward to
So yeah, we'll go ahead and maybe ask the board members then to turn on your cameras, because we're going to, the staff, Devin, is asking for a board vote on this. So if we could get everyone to turn on their cameras. And I will first ask for a motion to approve the addition of a standard setting project on alternative products for the processed foods industry, noting that it would be included in the current standard setting project, and so essentially be an expansion of that project to include the processed foods industry. So do I hear a motion to approve?
Also move.
All right, so moved. I hear a second. I saw a hand. I saw a Mark.
Yeah, I can second.
Thank you. So all those in favor, say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
All those
Aye.
opposed? Oh, Verity, that's all those opposed? Looks like seeing none, hearing none. We will count that as approved, unanimous approval there. And we'll look forward to this project moving forward in a somewhat expanded fashion. So you can invite Devin back if there's anything else she would like to say, and invite Brian to jump in if he's got anything to add.
Nothing else for me. Thanks, Jeff.
Great. Thank you, Devin. Brian?
No, nothing further from me, Jeff. Just a thanks to the board, especially calling back to that May board meeting where there were a lot of great questions and these kind of pushing our thinking around this industry specifically that helped kind of lead to kind of digging deeper in this, which Devin has obviously led since that time. And then also just appreciate the observers from the public, including some investors that reached out afterwards to kind of help share their views that really helped inform the thinking and take this updated position to include the processed foods industry in the scope of the project. So I think it's a good outcome here, and look forward to Devin leading the project, continuing to lead the project rather, and the next steps. So thank you, Jeff, and to the full board.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. That's a great point too. Again, it's when we think about the transparency of the work that we do, it's not just in public comment periods, but also the public board meetings as an opportunity to lead to feedback and we hope improve the quality of the work that we do. Okay, great. So now we are turning to our last major topic for our board meeting, and for that we've got Marvin Smith here, who is the Director of Research, Market Engagement, and so he's going to be talking to us about some, relative to the other things that we've been talking about today, some very early stage thinking and engagement that's taking place in the marine transportation industry. So Marvin, welcome.
Great, thanks, Jeff. So the objective of today's session is really just to share an overview of the discussions and insights that we gained from this marine transportation working group. So just to be clear, this isn't a project proposal, but rather a preview of what staff learned from a series of conversations that we had focused on both current and emerging sustainability issues that are impacting the marine transportation industry, and that also have the potential for agenda-aligned standard setting. So to move on to the next slide to talk a little bit more about context, the working group really came about because there's a lot of enthusiasm for the SASB standards in the marine transportation industry. And we're excited to have seen a handful of really robust SASB-aligned disclosures from leading companies in the industry, with many market participants voicing quite strong support for the value of the SASB standards. That being said, some market participants have suggested that there are certain elements of the standards that fall short of the desired decision usefulness, and that there may be an opportunity to address these concerns via standard setting activities. So due to the recommendations of several SASB standards advisory group members, we decided to form the working group to identify and inform staff of priority topics to consider for future improvements to the industry standard. So moving on, the scope of the working group discussion, we really wanted to start with something quite broad, just to go on to the next slide here. We didn't want to have too narrow of a discussion. We wanted to dissect the standards and explore all the opportunities to improve the content. So feedback on the standards consisted of thoughts on everything from the activity metrics to the technical protocols, as well as emerging issues in the industry. And it was really great to see how much feedback came from the working group participants. So to move to the next slide, to talk a little bit about who those working group participants were, they consisted of a dozen experts from primarily companies and other organizations focused specifically on shipping and logistics. And most of the participants were from Europe-based organizations. And it was really important for us to start with a small and engaged group of really enthusiastic individuals at this stage in our research, with the understanding that if we were going to pursue standard setting down the line, we would of course need additional market feedback, particularly from investors. And so this group is, I think, not entirely representative of the makeup of the entire marine transportation industry, but it is pretty well representative of those that have produced SASB-aligned disclosures. So moving on to the next slide, the working group met in a series of sessions over 4 months. And we first began by providing an overview of the group objectives, the SASB standard setting process, and provided clarity on how participants could provide useful and actionable feedback. Then for the next session, we provided an in-depth overview of the SASB standards conceptual framework. And that was really just so that working group participants had a clear understanding of our approach to standard setting when then helping us prioritize their feedback. We then determined, based on group feedback, that the priority disclosure topics to review for potential improvements were really the greenhouse gas emissions and air quality topics. We then had 2 sessions to discuss in more detail those respective topics. So moving on, this is just a heat map of some of the topic level feedback that we received from the working group participants. As I noted earlier, the scope of the working group was really quite broad. So there were a lot of different themes that were touched on in the feedback. But as it relates specifically to topics and metrics, the group really coalesced around prioritizing the research opportunities related to the GHG emissions and air quality topics. And this isn't a huge surprise given that from everything that I came to understand from the working group participants, decarbonization is really a priority for the industry right now. Many of the working group participants also recommended that we investigate the issue of ship end of life. I'm not really going to go into a lot of detail about this issue, but just so that everyone understands, this refers to the financial impacts that can arise from irresponsible ship recycling and end-of-life management practices. And this is certainly a growing area of concern for investors and regulators. So if mismanaged, ship recycling processes can really pose risks to the environment, as well as worker health and safety. And the Hong Kong Convention and the EU ship recycling regulation are just examples of measures that can lead to significant fines and reputational risks to companies that aren't really effectively addressing the issue of ship end of life. So to move on and talk a little bit more about what came up in the GHG emissions topic, if we go to the next slide, there were a handful of concerns that were brought up with regards to this topic. And again, I don't intend to go into great technical detail on every aspect, but I did want to highlight just a couple of examples. So there was feedback from members that we need to really consider whether we want companies to report tank to wake emissions numbers only, or if we also want to include well to wake. So tank to wake calculations consider the emissions that result from fuels that are burned once already in the tank, but others have suggested that this could be misleading. So just by way of example, using a tank to wake approach could really misrepresent the total climate and health impacts of shipping fuels. If you take a carbon neutral tank to wake fuel like hydrogen, it doesn't really produce any tailpipe emissions, but the way that hydrogen is produced has a large impact on its life cycle emissions. And so this is a major concern, again, because decarbonization is a priority for the industries, and there's a lot of discussions about what should be calculated in the total life cycle of the emissions there. And this really kind of links back a little bit to the earlier discussion we had about the application of industry-specific metrics and how we need to be thoughtful about how and when we would consider further tailoring a metric that appears kind of broadly in multiple industries and what the trade-offs are there. Another piece of feedback that came up was around the fact that we ask entities to disclose the average energy efficiency design index, or the EEDI. And this is for ships in grams of carbon dioxide per ton nautical mile. And the EEDI is a technical measure that promotes the use of more energy efficient equipment. And an engine's EEDI differs based upon ship design and size. And so it may not be an indicator that's actually gives you insights into operational efficiency of a vessel. So this particular metric may not be fully representationally faithful or complete. Some participants offered alternatives such as the EEOI, which is the Energy Efficiency Operational Indicator, which is the total carbon emissions in each time period per unit of revenue ton miles, as well as the Annual Efficiency Ratio, which is the ratio of a ship's carbon emissions per actual capacity distance. And in some of the SASB aligned disclosures, we see modifications to actually use some of these measurements. And then moving on to the next slide, talking about air quality, the feedback on the sole metric under the air quality topic was really focused on the lack of completeness, decision usefulness, and cost effectiveness of the metric. with many participants suggesting that, as it's currently written, the air quality metric asks for information from companies that's not really consistently or easily measured, and as a result, it's hard to disclose. So there was really a recommendation to refine the quantitative elements currently outlined, but also to consider adding a qualitative measure that could allow companies to explain their management. So to move on to kind of the next steps, for us, it's really to evaluate what a potential project scope could look like, given the insights that we've gained from the working group feedback and our independent research. We would then need to assess the team's capacity and the project portfolio to really determine where a project around these previously mentioned themes could potentially fit into our project pipeline. And then, of course, we would need to continue to engage industry experts, especially investors who may have views on these issues. So I'll just pause there and see if the board has any questions right now.
Thanks, Marvin. Yeah, actually, so I have maybe one question for you. This is a big picture kind of question, I think. This is not the sort of thing that we typically do right now in some ways in terms of like forming an industry working group per se. Historically, it actually was in some ways like kind of like the basis for how we developed the initial provisional standards was through industry working groups. But given your role in terms of market engagement and how that can create a feedback loop that offers opportunities to improve the standards, like how do you see this kind of fitting in relative to other ways in which we get input and feedback and do market engagement?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeff. And I think it was really effective, particularly in this industry. And I think a lot of it had to do with kind of where the industry was at in terms of really looking to better understand the ESG disclosure landscape and a lot of the enthusiasm and a deep understanding of the SASB standards. So I think it was easy for them to dive into those conversations. And also, we also had a solid foundation of relationships that we were able to build upon to form the group. So I think it was really effective for this case. I think it may be that in other cases, it might not be the most effective approach in soliciting feedback from a given industry, or there may be other ways to go about it. But I think it's certainly an approach that we can replicate in certain industries when the conditions are appropriate.
Great, thanks. And any sense for like how we should think of like how should the public think about industry working groups versus things like the standards advisory group, for example? How do they kind of
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think first off, we always welcome feedback from the market. So I would encourage anyone who has feedback that they'd like to provide on the existing standards content or emerging issues to please visit the provide feedback page and give us that feedback kind of regardless of the format of that feedback. But I will say that another opportunity to engage is the standards advisory group. So for individuals that are interested in being a part of a standing committee of volunteer industry experts that we tap for feedback, that is an avenue that exists, and we welcome people to apply if they're interested by visiting the SASB Standards Advisory Group page.
Actually, just maybe on that, if you think about this is an industry working group of companies, right? Versus the standards advisory group has a bit of a different makeup. So if you want to just share a few statistics on that, I know you probably have them on the top of your head.
Yeah, I do. So the standards advisory group is a mix of corporates, investors, and subject matter experts. Right now, it's about 60% corporates or so, 25% subject matter experts, and the rest are investors. And that's a group that we tap not only on industry-specific issues, but on thematic issues that cut across multiple industries. So it's a mix of sort of one-on-one engagements, small group conversations, and issues that are on, again, more sort of topic, metric level concerns, as well as broader implementation-related discussions. And I will say that the Standards Advisory Group, again, was really valuable in leading to the formation of this particular working group, because we were receiving and proactive feedback from standards advisory group members suggesting that this approach could be effective. And I think it was. So we're really keen to listen to members and gain their knowledge and understanding of what approach might be most effective for us to solicit feedback.
It's helpful. Thanks, Marvin. Verity.
Marvin, I'm not sure if you said that's in your remarks, but I believe this whole working group was surfaced thanks to one of the members of the Standards Advisory Group who sort of reached across the network to bring in companies and investors who are focused on this industry. And that's exactly what we would hope for from our members of the Standards Advisory Group. So this is really wonderful to see, and I'm particularly excited by the potential solutions to questions or needs that investors are struggling with to find the appropriate data and sort of willingness of investors to provide this data. And in particular, I'm thinking about this Scope 3 emissions potential kind of offering that the companies in this industry are thinking about, how to provide more useful and applicable information related to their business activities. And that is music to my ears. And I just wanted to say, I guess, in terms of next steps, when we're evaluating the potential project scope of a potential project, I think we'll want to also do a check for investor interest, right? So whichever dimension of potentially surfaced ideas to consider that came out of this working group, we'll want to make sure to get that investor check for the usefulness of new standard setting. And I guess I would hope that you could just confirm, Marvin, that we're not just taking companies' word for it. We're not going to just go to standard setting work only based on what companies would like to see removed from the standards, but rather that we will be committed to seeking market feedback from both users and preparers.
That's exactly right, Verity. An obvious gap in the working group participation was the investor perspective. And so in advance of even proposing any standard setting project, it would be really essential for us to better understand investor views on these issues.
Yeah, Marvin, it's a nice switch, though. I know certainly a few years back, we had plenty of investors talking to us, and we struggled a little bit to get corporates and industry participants. So it is a validation of how seriously I think companies are taking this. Certainly the external factors have had an impact, and SASB's credibility does. So back when we were first working on this work 3-4 years ago, clearly getting credible insights from companies in an organized fashion was a real challenge. So I welcome having an overwhelming number of industry companies represented. We will indeed have to balance it. This one is a kind of an interesting sticky wicket, though, and I think we got to think a little bit about it. Where do we draw scope lines? This well to tank concept is interesting, as is tank to well. And certainly this is basically trying to look at the commodity that the boats are carrying and the ramifications of getting that cargo to the boat and then away from the boat. And so that I worry a little bit that may be somewhat outside the scope of what, because it's a broader issue in transportation, I think also. And the issue you mentioned around hydrogen is also an interesting one that, at least with something like electric vehicles, we kind of have this sense that it's best to concentrate the energy need and let the power units become more and more efficient. But at least so far, we haven't really driven, so to speak, to try to have companies quantify the efficiency of the electricity that's going into their vehicles. But I think this is a good learning phase, maybe for things that may hit more broadly in transportation also. And so even though to some extent the marine analysis has lagged the automotive industry, I think this will be an interesting viewpoint on this. And clearly the factor of just converting all of your boats to hydrogen that at least don't have, quote, tailpipe emissions when they're burned, but create almost as big a footprint prior to that, is something we've got to continue to look at. So, beyond scope 1, that does get more and more important. And I bet that issue is much bigger than just the maritime industry, really. So I think I guess my one takeaway on this is it's great to have deep participation. We need some experts, I think, in this outside the corporate world. And then we can also maybe spend a little time thinking about the broader ramification of transportation, energy generation, and how do we look beyond, just the quote impact where the rubber meets the road or the tiller hits the water. So good food for thought.
Yeah, thanks, Kurt. I agree wholeheartedly. And there's definitely going to be insights that I think we can take from these conversations that may apply to other industries, particularly in transportation as well. So.
Thanks, Kurt. Lloyd.
Well, Kurt said the word I was going to say at the top as well, scope. I think this is a very exciting opportunity, I think, for SASB because number one, it's an industry with a lot of impacts, human and environmental, and no natural central regulator or source of standard setting on these matters. So I think this is a significant opportunity for SASB and pretty good point of reference for what kinds of projects can we be most additive on. Having said that, I think there is, because there are so many interesting and meaty things to work on, there probably should be some significant upfront work in consultation with the industry, but also in consultation with outside subject matter experts on where the focus should be. Since this is a much talked about industry, commercially extremely important and operating close to capacity, there will be different views. And so I think there will be a phase of, could call it adjudication or something, but where we're sorting through, okay, we know we want to get involved and we know that there's a lot to get involved on. So where are we going to put our focus and our efforts and where can we do the most good?
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Lloyd. Totally agree. We are small but mighty operations, so we have to be very focused in where we spend our efforts. Suzanne.
Yeah, and I think, again, much has been said by now. So I think from my experience, also companies mobilizing around various coalitions like the UN Global Compact. I think it's interesting to see this coalition around SASB because it's also an indication of the credibility of SASB as a partner in trying to actually approach some of these challenges that are bigger than what one company or two companies can do together. So I really welcome this, industry initiative and would be keen to follow the lessons learned to see what we can, what we may be able to replicate for the future. So just to say kudos to the group for leading that, and also to Marvin and the team for actually then embracing it and wrapping it into SASB's approach. So
and
really
Savannah,
excited to see this going forward.
It's certainly a validation of the importance of being industry relevant and focused, because there are some very unique twists that have big impacts here. So
yes.
Yeah, Suzanne, thanks for that comment. And I just want to echo the sentiment of thanking the working group participants for their incredibly valuable insights. I've focused on just a small piece of the really valuable nuggets that they shared with us, and a lot of other pieces would be relevant to things like technical corrections, but they really did take a deep dive into the SASB standards and the issues impacting their industry. So we're thankful for their time and contributions to the group.
Thanks, Suzanne. Yeah, to this point where we're talking earlier about the conceptual framework and whether we have in the conceptual framework all of the language, or have articulated the right language and the trade-offs to be able to navigate to excuse the pun for the shipping industry, but to be able to navigate through these trade-offs between doing things that might be more well suited to the particular business models that are prevalent in a given industry, but then create some gaps in the way that that other industries operate, and sometimes recognizing that one company may actually operate in two related industries. And so how do we talk about what those trade-offs might be, and how do we ultimately make decisions around what's going to best accomplish the mission that we are set out to do here, which is to provide decision useful information broadly across the marketplace. So really interesting topic, and it sounds like there is a lot that's been learned and a lot to still kind of be done. Marvin, anything else you want to say to kind of like wrap the session?
Yeah, I'll just say, just to go to the next slide, if people do have comments that they would like to share, or they'd like to kind of understand or are thinking about some issues, please reach out. My contact information is here. It's just marvin.smith@thevrf.org, and I would be happy to keep you looped in on where our research is at. So that's it for me.
All right, great. Thank you, Marvin. Appreciate you being here today. Appreciate your work and working with this industry working group, and everything you do to kind of lead our engagement efforts so widely, actually. So you're doing a lot. Appreciate all that. So maybe I'll invite Brian back. So Brian, you're still out there with us?
I'm here, Jeff. Thank you.
So we've kind of moved through the topics for today. I wanted to give a chance, after having kind of moved through a number of projects at various stages, to maybe just give you an opportunity to think about, from the team's perspective, what we see as kind of like any big themes, takeaways that you want to kind of conclude with today.
Yeah, fantastic. And why don't we jump forward 2 slides here? One more, the concluding remarks slide. So yeah, thank you, Jeff. I very much appreciate the full board here for investing the time in preparing for the board meeting, the ongoing engagements with staff, and then of course the meeting today. Found it very, very helpful and very informative on multiple levels. Just calling back to the first session when Lynn provided the project pipeline overview. I think the board is well aware that there are a few key projects with board kind of staff proposals on final standards updates or other exposure drafts that we're bringing forward, and so quite a bit of activity that we're anticipating over this next period. So stay tuned on that, all positive developments. And then looking out a little bit further to what Lynn got at in terms of thinking about the next board meeting later this year, several project proposals on staff's radar. So lots of action, lots of momentum across staff, and importantly in partnership with the board and moving the project portfolio forward and continuing to build it out. The conceptual framework session I found extremely helpful. I mean, these are such pivotal kind of core issues to the SASB standards around materiality and industry specificity. And Jeff, I think you did a good job yourself of bringing the conceptual framework in to virtually every single session throughout, even this last session or two that were very marine transportation and alternative meat and dairy, where we know these are the issues that were discussed are extremely important from a climate perspective. And if we think about maybe like a broadly applicable climate standard, or even the TCFD recommendations can certainly add value. And then the view of the SASB standards of really that need to understand business model and activities, resulting sustainability and financial impacts in order to really get to decision useful information for investors and information that's relevant to enterprise value. So really helpful discussion on the conceptual framework, and I think will help staff and the board, the project team, keep moving forward with developing a revised version and just getting a little bit more specific in what the solutions might look like, or trade-offs, as you referenced earlier, Jeff. The tailings project, appreciated the board's views and support from several board members on the revisions that we looking to post-exposure draft, kind of largely arising out of market feedback we received in the comment period. And that's a good example of where we think we're just about at the finish line there, and expect to bring the board the final kind of proposed standards update for those 2 industry standards that are within project scope and the kind of proposed final basis for conclusions for a board final review and vote. Similar message with the systemic risk project. I think even more straightforward with no changes will be proposed post-exposure draft, removal of the topic from the asset management industry standard, but noting that several kind of, or at least one or two kind of pre-agenda issues to keep exploring in the abundance of kind of ongoing research and consultation that staff and the board is continually doing to help inform the projects, where to pick up research or standard setting projects. And then lastly, on marine transportation, we really, as we know, we just jumped to the other end of the spectrum, that kind of pre-agenda phase, and saw one approach that the staff took in putting together this working group. A lot of great insights that came out of it. Really valuable views from a number of board members here on both the process that was used, this kind of pre-agenda, pre-standard setting activities process to gather this industry input, and then the importance of next phases, continuing to round that out, importantly with investor input, thinking about project scope, prioritization across the portfolio, and moving forward. So thanks to Marvin for leading that work, and really the full board for being engaged with it and sharing a lot of helpful views. I think that's it for me. Jeff, we know, just again, a number of things are on the radar coming up over the next period here, some project decisions, project proposals, and so forth. And then, as we referenced a few times throughout the meeting, just how extremely important the kind of developments going on both around the VRF in the landscape, and that VRF is very connected to and engaging in directly. Calling out the example of the IFRS Foundation and the Technical Readiness Working Group, all extremely important developments in the market, ones that we're excited to be very engaged in, and interested and excited to see how they will play out here. So once again, thanks to you, Jeff, and the full board for the productive meeting today.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate the recap there. Appreciate the thanks to the board. I also appreciate the board for being here, for being engaged. I would also just say that I think I could speak for the board, but the board's welcome to speak for themselves as well. We really appreciate the work of the team, and I know that Lynn and Marvin have stepped into leadership roles there. Appreciate all that they're doing. Greg, who couldn't be here today. Greg, if you're listening in, don't listen in. I know you're getting married, so but we look forward to your return. And Brian, for your tremendous role in leading the research team and helping to engage on all these policy directives and playing such a crucial role there in representing the Value Reporting Foundation in those efforts. And I would just say, I know that we are always looking to hire new people. There's, I don't know if you want to say anything in particular. There's opportunity to plug that right now, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, continuing to grow and build the team, the technical staff, the research team here internally, and just incredibly, both growing space in terms of needs and opportunities, as well as just growing impact in the market, growing kind of elevating role in the market. I'd even just reference that we just recently crossed a milestone where over half of the global S&P 1200 have implemented the SASB standards, and just thrilling milestone to cross compared to we're just not that long ago, a few years ago, a small fraction of that number. And so really growing impact in the board's work, and everything that the technical staff has the benefit and the opportunity to dive into, and working on crucial industries for the capital markets and around sustainability. And so a number of open roles across the team for technical staff positions. Anyone that's interested can go to the VRF, the Value Reporting Foundation website, and the careers page. More information there, and certainly welcome interest from candidates. Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. In other words, we accept your input and we'll accept your applications as well. So, it's just such a hot area, a great time to be involved in this space, and really appreciate all the good work that the team is doing. So thanks again, Brian. Maybe we'll go to the next slide and just mention that we've got, of course, The next public board meetings will be in December, and this will be about a week after the Value Reporting Foundation is going to have its inaugural first symposium. So this will essentially be a combination of the symposium that was traditionally done by the SASB for the last number of years, as well as the IR has also had an event that they have done annually as well. And so now that we are merged as the Value Reporting Foundation, we're going to also merge those events. It's going to be virtual this year, and but I believe that you can now register for that. So encourage everybody, if you're not aware of that, to go ahead and check that out and be engaged through that process in earlier December, and then we'll have our next standards board meeting in December. The public one, I think, will be on the 15th. So looking forward to that as well. But with that, I think we're actually going to wrap a little bit early today, which is always, you know, give everybody a little bit of time back on their calendar. And so appreciate all of the input, the engagement, both from the marketplace as well from the board members and the staff, as mentioned. So with that, we'll go ahead and close it down and say thank you for being here today.